Why life was brutal in ancient Egypt. Boring history for sleep. Welcome, weary traveler, to a journey through the sands of time. As the stars wheel overhead and the night grows quiet, I invite you to rest your head and let your imagination wander to a land of sand and stone, of mighty rivers and towering pyramids. This is ancient Egypt, a civilization of wonder and mystery, but also of hardship and struggle. As you drift off to slumber, perhaps curled in a cozy bed or stretched out on a soft couch, take a moment to ponder. What corner of the globe do you call home? What hour has struck on the clock where you now lay your head? Whether it's the witching hour or the first blush of dawn, I bid you welcome. If you enjoy voyages into history, tales told in soothing tones as you slip into dreams, I encourage you to subscribe. There are many more stories to come. But tonight, our focus turns to the trials and tribulations of life in ancient Egypt. It's a time that looms large in our collective imaginations. Soaring monuments, golden masked kings, and secrets of mummification have long held us in thrall. Popular media paints a romantic picture of this distant age, of pyramids glittering under the sun, and nobility draped in fine linen and glittering jewels as they cruise down the Nile. And while Egypt's accomplishments were indeed staggering, the precision and scale of the Great Pyramids, the sublime artistry of their temples and tombs, the sophistication of their writing and astronomy, we must remember that these marvels were built on the bent backs of multitudes. For every pharaoh lounging in opulent palaces, thousands of Egyptians toiled in fields, labored in workshops, and fought in wars. Their lives were often difficult, dangerous, and short. In the unforgiving environment of the Nile River Valley, existence was precarious. The annual floods that irrigated their crops could just as easily wipe out villages and seed famine. The same blazing sun that baked the bricks of majestic monuments also scorched the laborers who stacked them ever skyward. From the lowliest servant to the loftiest scribe, life in ancient Egypt was rife with adversity. So join me as we part the curtains of romance and nostalgia and glimpse the stark realities faced by the men and women who built and sustained this dazzling civilization. We'll explore 6 key aspects of Egyptian life that made it a constant struggle for survival: the oppressive social hierarchy, the grind of forced labor, the ravages of war, the dangers lurking in their own homes, the spectre of sickness and injury, and the ever-present sting of grief as they buried their dead. Along the way, we'll zoom in on individual lives and stories, putting human faces to the grand sweep of history. We'll see mighty pharaohs facing crises that shook the foundations of their authority, but also humble craftsmen and farmers striving to provide for their families against steep odds. And though we'll encounter suffering and injustice, we'll also marvel at the resilience of the Egyptian spirit, a spirit that endured for 3 millennia. So make yourself comfortable, dear listener, and let the cares of the day slip away. The Nile is rising, the sun is climbing over the distant cliffs, and there's work to be done. For life, in all its beauty and brutality, stops for no one in this realm of shifting sands and ageless wonders. Let us begin our journey with the very thing that made Egypt's triumphs and tragedies possible, the river that has always been its lifeblood, and at times its greatest peril. The mighty Nile has long been called Egypt's greatest blessing, the source of the fertile black soil and abundant water that allowed a sophisticated civilization to flourish in an otherwise harsh desert. But living at the mercy of the river's cycles could be a harrowing thing. Each summer, the Nile would surge over its banks, swollen with monsoon rains and snowmelt from distant mountains. The floodwaters drowned the surrounding fields and pastures, washing away boundary stones and landmarks. Farmers watched nervously as the murky tide lapped at the threshold of their mud-brick houses, praying to the god Hapi to halt the deluge before it could sweep away their homes and lives. But they desperately needed that flood, for it carried tons of Ethiopian silt to replenish their fields for planting. In a good year, the inundation would recede by autumn, leaving behind a thick layer of black, fertile mud. Farmers would fling seed into this rich soil, reaping bountiful harvests of wheat, barley, and vegetables to fill their bellies and their tax coffers. But the Nile was fickle. Sometimes the floods were anemic, barely wetting the lips of a parched landscape. The crops would shrivel in their furrows, leaving the spectre of famine looming over the valley. Other times the river would surge too high, drowning seedlings, livestock and villagers unlucky enough to be caught in its roiling path. The very first pharaoh of a unified Egypt, King Narmer, learned this hard lesson around 3000 BC. According to legend, one summer, the Nile's flood failed utterly, shriveling to a trickle between its sun-baked banks. Crops withered, herds of cattle wasted to rack and bone, and his subjects began to starve. Narmer must have watched in mounting dread as the river receded ever more, the possibility of losing his freshly forged kingdom to drought and famine growing with each rainless day. He ordered prayers and sacrifices to the gods, even commanding that a young virgin be hurled into the Nile as an offering. Still the river shrank. At last, in desperation, Narmer undertook a pilgrimage to the island of Elephantine, a traditional center of worship for the god Hapi. There, prostrating himself before the deity's statue, Narmer vowed to dedicate his realm and his reign to the Nile's everlasting glory, if only Hapi would bless Egypt with his waters once more. Whether by divine intervention or lucky timing, the rains finally came, the Nile swelled to its banks, and Egypt was delivered from disaster. But Narmer would not be the last pharaoh to learn the hard way that the Nile's bounty came at a price. A lesson felt most keenly not in the halls of power, but in the humble villages that lined the riverbanks, where the annual floods could spell the difference between prosperity and ruin. The harsh realities of life in ancient Egypt extended to their beliefs about the afterlife as well. The Egyptians were obsessed with death and what came after. They believed that upon dying, their souls would face a harrowing journey through the underworld, filled with fearsome monsters and perilous tests before hopefully reaching the paradise of the Field of Reeds. But even this reward was not guaranteed. First, the deceased's heart would be weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was found heavier than the feather, weighed down by sin and unrighteousness, it would be devoured by the demon Amit, a terrifying beast with the head of a crocodile, the front legs of a lion, and the back legs of a hippopotamus. To be consumed by Amit meant to die a second death, vanishing into oblivion for eternity, never to reach the afterlife. As a result, Egyptians devoted enormous energy and resources towards ensuring a successful passage to the next world. Tombs and burial chambers were painstakingly prepared and stocked with grave goods like food, furniture, jewelry, and servants, all the necessities and luxuries they would need for eternity. The walls were painted with spells and inscriptions from the Book of the Dead to guide and protect the deceased on their perilous underworld journey. The most crucial step in this process was mummification. Egyptians believed that the soul needed an earthly body to return to in the afterlife. So after death, the corpse would undergo an extensive embalming process to preserve it for eternity. The internal organs would be removed, the body dried in salts, then wrapped in layers of linen soaked in resins. Even for the wealthy, this sacred rite was an expensive, lengthy, and complex procedure lasting up to 70 days. For the pharaohs, no expense was spared in safeguarding their eternal life. Perhaps the most extravagant example was King Tutankhamun, the famed boy king who ruled in the 14th century BC. Although he died unexpectedly at only 19, he was still interred in a multi-chambered, treasure-filled tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Over 5,000 precious objects were buried with him, including 6 chariots, thrones, jewelry, statues, furniture, clothes, and weapons, not to mention the magnificent nested coffins and golden death mask. When Howard Carter unsealed Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the dazzling golden treasures captivated the world. But they also reflected the Egyptians' endless efforts to secure their fragile shot at eternal life. And Tut was just a short-lived minor king. Imagine what must have been buried with the great pharaohs like Khufu, Amenhotep III, and Ramses II, who ruled for decades. Sadly, most of their tombs were looted in antiquity, the precious grave goods stolen, the mummies destroyed or scattered. Even King Tut's tomb had been infiltrated by robbers twice before its final sealing. The fear of tomb robbery was a constant spectre that haunted the Egyptians. They built cleverly hidden entrances, false doors and passages, deep shafts and decoy chambers to thwart thieves. Armed guards were posted, and priests made offerings to the deceased kings daily. Elaborately worded curses were carved, invoking the wrath of the gods on any who dared desecrate the tombs. And with good reason, the punishments for grave robbing were among the most brutal in Egyptian law. Convicted tomb raiders faced horrific executions, their bodies then denied proper burial, to doom their own hopes for the afterlife. The ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus tells the grim tale of the funeral of Ramses II around 1213 BC. Diodorus writes that during the procession, the king's son noticed a thief tunneling into the royal tomb. The prince could have stopped him on the spot, but let him continue so he could later capture the entire gang in the act. When the trap walls sprung, the thieves faced a ghastly fate. Diodorus recounts, "The king gave orders that the robbers should all promptly be put to a horrible death. To deter any others from like attempts, they were placed still living on skewers and roasted to death over a slow fire. A lurid warning to any who dared cross the sacred boundary between this world and the next." Even the vast hidden cemeteries and secret tomb shafts in the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings couldn't stop the robberies. During the reign of Ramses IX in the 12th century BC, tomb raiding had grown so frequent that the king was forced to dispatch a special commission to investigate. A scribe named Amenhotep was sent out to inspect the royal tombs, and he came back with an alarming report of widespread looting. Amenhotep found the mummies of great kings and queens of the past, cast out of their coffins, dumped ignobly on the ground, stripped of their jewels and amulets. Their unwrapped corpses lay twisted and mouldering, prey to rats and jackals. Even the mummy of the mighty Ramses II had been vandalized, his onyx and precious stone eyes pried out by greedy hands. The investigators rounded up scores of suspects, from lowly stone cutters and woodworkers to the mayor and high priest of Thebes. The confession of one gold worker named Amenhotep reveals the sheer audacity of the tomb robbers. He admitted, "We tunneled into the corridors of the tomb of King Sobekemsaf. We found the king's mummy within, adorned with gold and many jewels. We stripped off the gold and jewels that we found on the mummy of the god, as well as the amulets and ornaments which were around his neck. We found the royal wife likewise. We stripped off all that we found upon her too. We set fire to their mummy cases, and we stole their furniture, which we found with them, vases of gold, silver, and bronze. The robbers seemed undeterred by the risk of divine retribution or gruesome execution. The golden allure was just too tempting in a world of such scarcity and hardship. Even the sacred sleep of the pharaohs could not rest undisturbed. So perhaps the Egyptians' obsession with death was well-founded. They poured their hopes into the hereafter because their reality in this life was often so brutally unforgiving. For kings and commoners alike, the spectre of death loomed large and constant. Mummification was a desperate grasp at immortality, and the lavish tombs a priceless insurance policy for a peaceful eternal rest after a lifetime of toil and uncertainty. But in the end, not even the mummies were safe from the long hand of grave robbers and the unrelenting hardships of life along the Nile. The afterlife was the ancient Egyptians' only refuge from the cruelties of this world. And even that was a gamble not all would win. But Tutankhamun, at least, rested undisturbed for over 3,200 years until Howard Carter made his famous discovery. And now, the boy king lives again, immortalized in an exhibit seen by millions, a gilded relic from a harsher age. And so, as we drift off to sleep tonight, in the comfort of our modern lives, we can appreciate the immense distance between our world and theirs, and marvel at what the Egyptians endured in their eternal reach for life everlasting on the shifting sands of the Nile. Life in ancient Egypt was fraught with uncertainty, hardship, and brutality. Even for powerful pharaohs like Thutmose III, who reigned in the 15th century BC, danger and struggle were never far away. Thutmose III was one of Egypt's greatest warrior kings, leading at least 17 military campaigns during his reign. He fought relentlessly to expand Egypt's empire and secure its borders against rival powers. The Egyptians' most formidable foe during this time were the Canaanite city-states in modern-day Syria and Palestine. After decades of growing Canaanite power, Thutmose III decided a reckoning was in order. In the spring of 1457 BC, he marched his armies out of Egypt and into Canaan to confront his enemies. But campaigning was a difficult and dangerous undertaking, even for a pharaoh. Thutmose and his men faced grueling marches through the scorching Sinai desert. Water was scarce, and heat exhaustion took a heavy toll. When they finally reached the hill country of Canaan, Thutmose found his enemies waiting at the city of Megiddo. The Canaanites had gathered a massive coalition army, with thousands of infantry and hundreds of chariots. They occupied a strong position, with the steep slopes of Mount Carmel protecting their flanks. Thutmose had a strategic decision to make. He could take the easy route and march around the mountain, avoiding the enemy's strongpoint, but giving them time to escape. Or he could take the risky path, a narrow, winding mountain pass that led directly to Megiddo. It would mean squeezing his entire army through a tight canyon where they could be easily ambushed. In a daring gamble, Thutmose chose the direct route. As the Egyptians threaded their way through the pass, the Canaanites attacked. Arrows, sling stones, and boulders rained down from the cliffs above. Men and horses screamed as they were struck, the narrow defile turning into a killing zone. But Thutmose urged his army forward. Bleeding and battered, they eventually passed through the gauntlet and spilled out onto the plain in front of Megiddo. There they met the Canaanite coalition in open battle. The clash was long and bloody, with heavy fighting between the chariot forces. But Thutmose's military skill and the tenacity of his soldiers won the day. The Egyptians routed the Canaanites and pursued them to the city gates. Thutmose later boasted that his enemies were scattered like chaff before the wind. He claimed to have personally captured 340 enemy prisoners and seized over 2,000 horses and nearly 1,000 chariots. The Battle of Megiddo was a decisive victory for Thutmose, but the larger war was far from over. The surviving Canaanites took refuge behind the city's thick walls. Thutmose laid siege, but his men were hungry and battle-weary. Megiddo's defenses were strong, and there was no quick way in. So Thutmose ordered his men to build a massive wooden palisade around the entire city, hemming in the defenders and cutting off any chance of escape or relief. It was a daunting construction project. Thousands of trees had to be felled and transported. The Egyptian troops worked for weeks in the heat and dust, encircling the city with an impenetrable timber barricade. Trapped inside, hunger and disease soon began to take their toll on the Canaanites. The city's food stores dwindled and people began to starve. The will to resist slowly withered. After 7 long months, Megiddo finally capitulated. Thutmose entered the city in triumph, claiming its riches and taking its rulers captive. It was a great victory, but one that came at a steep price. The siege of Megiddo shows the hardships and brutality of ancient warfare, even for the victors. During the long months of encirclement and bombardment, Thutmose's men faced short rations, sickness, and enemy raids. They were far from home, camped in an enemy land, not knowing if they would live to see their families again. Even in triumph, they had to cope with the aftermath, rotting corpses, devastated fields, and the haunting memories of close combat. Such was the cost of creating and maintaining an empire. After Megiddo, Thutmose would go on to conquer many more Canaanite cities, extending Egypt's dominion all the way to the Euphrates River. But as his power grew, so did the strains on his country. Endless campaigns meant that farmers were taken away from their fields and artisans from their workshops for months or years at a time. The flow of tribute from conquered lands enriched the royal treasury, but it didn't necessarily improve the lives of the common people. In fact, the burdens of empire often fell heaviest on those at the bottom of the social ladder. The constant need for manpower led to an increase in forced labor and conscription. For the average Egyptian, being drafted into the army or a royal work gang was a deeply traumatic experience. It meant leaving behind family and home, marching hundreds of miles on foot, and enduring the dangers and drudgery of military life. Hand-to-hand combat was a terrifying prospect, but so was falling victim to dysentery or heat stroke. For many recruits, the greatest danger was simply being worked to death. We get a glimpse of this reality from ancient sources like the tomb inscription of Amenemheb, an army officer who served under Thutmose III. Amenemheb recounts the hardships of campaign, from crossing crocodile-infested rivers to marching through wind-whipped desert sandstorms. He describes a grisly battle against the Nubians, in which his unit had to clamber over piles of enemy corpses to storm a fortress. In another gruesome passage, he tells of how Thutmose ordered the severed hands of slain foes to be piled before him as a grim accounting of the day's killing. Such ghastly tallies were par for the course in Egypt's wars of conquest. After one campaign, Thutmose had his scribes catalogue the various body parts he'd harvested from the battlefield: 1,692 hands, 29 penises, and so on. These were the bloody receipts of empire, used to proclaim the king's power and cow his enemies into submission. But they also reflect the pitiless brutality of the age. For those caught up in the gears of the pharaoh's war machine, life was often nasty, brutal, and short. Of course, it wasn't just soldiers who bore the brunt of imperial aggression. The inhabitants of conquered lands were also treated with great cruelty. Cities that resisted were burned, their people murdered or enslaved. Prisoners of war were beaten, tortured for information, and often executed to send a message. We can see this in a passage from the Annals of Thutmose III, which describes the fate of a rebellious Canaanite ruler. His Majesty captured the city of Joppa. He carried off its chief, his wife, his children, and all his possessions. He razed the city, sowed it with barley. As for its chief, he hung him up in front of the city that had been his. Thutmose was sending a clear warning: defy the pharaoh and you will suffer the most horrific consequences. Such terroristic spectacles were meant to instill obedience through raw fear. And for many of the downtrodden people of Canaan, they were brutally effective. The yoke of Egyptian imperialism would weigh heavy on the region for centuries to come. But despite their warrior king's long list of triumphs, the average Egyptian saw little benefit from all this bloodshed. Most remained mired in poverty, toiling as peasant farmers or laborers on state projects. The great monuments built to glorify the kings were often stained with the sweat and blood of the poor. Even in times of peace, life was a struggle for survival, and that struggle began from the moment of birth. For an ancient Egyptian child, the odds of living to see adulthood were crushingly slim. It is estimated that as many as 1 in 3 infants died before their first birthday. Those who made it out of infancy still had to run a harrowing gauntlet of malnutrition, accidents, infections, and parasites. Only about half of children lived past the age of 5. The evidence can be found in the cemeteries of ancient Egyptian villages, where tiny graves are heartbreakingly common. Childbirth itself was fraught with danger for both mother and child. Without modern medicine, many women died in labor from hemorrhage, eclampsia, or obstructed birth. Midwives used a variety of spells and ritual techniques that probably did little to improve outcomes. If a baby was stuck in the birth canal, the mother's life would be prioritized. The fetus might be dismembered in the womb with sharp instruments to allow extraction, a horrific practice that was nonetheless a common last resort. Even royal women were not immune to these dangers. Several of Thutmose III's own wives and daughters are known to have died in childbirth, including his eldest daughter Neferura. The grieving pharaoh had to bury his child in a lavish but tragically small sarcophagus in the Valley of the Kings. Such infant and childhood mortality was so rampant that Egyptians often avoided naming their babies for the first few months of life. They feared becoming too attached to a child who might soon perish. From birth to death, the spectre of loss and suffering loomed large. For bereaved parents, the experience was clearly traumatic, and it left a deep imprint on Egyptian culture. The Egyptians believed that the dead needed to be provisioned for the afterlife, so even the youngest children were often buried with miniature combs, pots, and toy figurines. These poignant grave goods reflect the effort to care for the child's spirit, even after death had cruelly intervened. In some cases, infants were mummified with the same lavish care given to adults. We know of a case from the city of Hawara in which a young mother died in childbirth along with her baby. Someone took great pains to mummify the two together, posing the infant at its mother's breast, as if peacefully nursing. It's a touching scene, but also a tragically common one. The fact that the Egyptians developed such elaborate mortuary practices for children speaks to the omnipresence of child death in their society. Those children lucky enough to survive infancy still faced many perils and hardships. Most were put to work at a very young age, helping in the fields, tending livestock, or learning a craft. Education was a rare privilege, limited to the children of the elite. For most commoners, life was a constant struggle to avoid hunger, to pay taxes, to placate the demands of their overseers and landlords. This precarious existence could be upended at any moment by events beyond the individual's control. The Nile's annual flood was the engine that drove Egyptian agriculture, but it was an unreliable and sometimes destructive master. If the waters rose too high, they could wash away entire villages, drowning people and livestock. If they receded too soon, the crops would wither, leading to famine. Even a slight fluctuation could spell disaster for thousands. One such famine is recorded in the inscriptions of the noble Ankh-Tifi, who lived during the chaotic First Intermediate period. Ankh-Tifi describes a time of soaring grain prices, rampant looting, and starving peasants from the north invading his province in search of food. He boasts feeding his own people while turning away the hungry hordes. even as they drop dead at his feet. The whole land has become like locusts, going in search of food. The people in the village are coming to my territory, with their children on their backs, to get grain here to live. I am the one who buries those who died on the road, out of fear of the royal anger. For the hapless refugees, dying on the roadside from hunger was apparently preferable to returning home and facing the king's wrath over their unauthorized migration. Such was the precarity and oppression of their lives. They were utterly at the mercy of the elements and their rulers. When the delicate balance that sustained them was upset, they faced a dreadful choice between the perils of flight or the certainty of starvation at home. The first intermediate period was a time of unusual strife, but localized famines and food shortages were distressingly common even in the best of times. Pests like locusts and grain beetles could consume as much as a quarter of the harvest in a bad year, and the pressure to hand over a sizable portion of their crop to the state left many farmers on the knife's edge of subsistence. For peasants, hunger was a constant companion, and the threat of losing everything was never far from mind. Many fell into debt during hard times and were forced to surrender their meager plots to powerful landlords. Court records show an endless litany of foreclosures, with whole families taken into bond servitude when they failed to pay up. These debt slaves could be bought, sold, rented out, or bequeathed like any other property. Their dependent status offered them little recourse against abuse and exploitation. Even for Egyptians who owned their own land, the demands of corvée labor could be crushing. During the flood season when they couldn't farm, peasants were often conscripted to work on the pharaoh's monumental building projects. This forced labor was supposed to be a form of in-kind taxation, but it frequently devolved into outright slavery. The work itself was backbreaking, hauling heavy loads of mud and stones under the scorching sun. Men dropped from exhaustion, crushed by falling blocks, or simply worked to death. You can see the human toil behind the great monuments in the ruins of the workers' village near the Giza pyramids. Skeletons found there show severe arthritis, especially in the lower vertebrae, a sign of long hours spent bent under heavy loads. Many have fractured limbs that healed crookedly, a mark of inadequate medical care. One poignant burial contains a couple still holding hands, united in death as they probably were in life's hardships. Of course, even in these humblest of remains, archaeologists have found evidence of care and humanity. Graves were dug with some goods to provision the deceased in the afterlife. A prized tool, a bead necklace, or a chunk of meat wrapped in linen to feed them for eternity. Family members who could afford to mummify even a little would often do so, carefully removing the organs and desiccating the body before burial. These practices reflect the deeply human need to honor lost loved ones, but they also bear witness to the harsh realities of the workers' lives. In one mass grave at Giza, piled haphazardly with the skeletons of laborers, Egyptologists found the remains of a woman still clutching her infant child. Both had clearly died on the job, and both bore the marks of malnutrition and physical stress. They were unnamed cogs in the pharaoh's great machine, worked to the point of collapse, and then buried with little ceremony in the shadow of the monuments they gave their lives to build. So for all its glories and wonders, life in ancient Egypt was often nasty, brutish, and short, especially for those at the bottom of the great social pyramid. They faced a constant struggle against the elements, backbreaking labor, hunger, disease, and a rigid hierarchy that kept them in their place. Even many nobles and priests led lives of surprising precarity, always jockeying for position and favor, always in danger of losing status through the political or supernatural displeasure of the king. Perhaps that is why, despite their reputation for conservatism, the Egyptians displayed a remarkable fascination with the transgressive and chaotic. The tombs of the elite are filled with images of animals and humans behaving in strange, unnatural ways. Cats herding geese, mice waging war on cats, animals acting as humans, and humans as animals. Such scenes are often humorous, but they also evoke a world turned upside down, where the iron rules of Mayat, or cosmic order, have broken down. One darkly comic papyrus satirically depicts the gods as a fractious and petty bunch, getting drunk at a banquet and hurling insults at one another. In this topsy-turvy vision, the sun god Ra casually orders his divine guests flayed, and their skins used to make a nice pair of sandals. Such irreverent stories allowed the Egyptians to safely transgress the sacred order, to imagine, if only for a moment, a different reality, not bound by the often pitiless logic of Maat. Even the Egyptian concept of the afterlife bears the imprint of their uniquely precarious existence. In a world where starvation and death were always close at hand, the field of reeds offered an inverted mirror image, an idealized landscape of lush crops and eternal bounty, where no one ever went hungry or suffered pain. But this afterlife was not guaranteed. It had to be earned through proper observance of rituals and obedience to the gods and the king. And even for those judged worthy, the path to paradise was harrowing. The deceased had to undertake a dangerous journey through the underworld, evading lakes of fire, pits of snakes, and the slavering jaws of the monstrous devourer. They had to recite the right spells and muster a small army of protective amulets and figurines. Only then could their hearts be weighed on the scale against the feather of truth. If it balanced, they were admitted to the field of reeds. But if their heart was heavy with sin, it would be tossed too. The Egyptian civilization is also renowned for its remarkable medical knowledge and practices for the time. The ancient Egyptians had a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of the human body and developed advanced treatments for various ailments. However, despite their progress, Egyptian medicine was still quite primitive by modern standards, and many procedures were gruesome ordeals for patients. Much of what we know about ancient Egyptian medicine comes from a fascinating document known as the Edwin Smith Papyrus. Dating back to around 1600 BC, this ancient medical text details 48 surgical cases and provides incredible insights into the practices of Egyptian physicians. One particularly striking case describes a complex cranial surgery performed on a patient with a severe skull fracture. According to the papyrus, a man was brought to the physician with a compound comminuted fracture of the skull. In layman's terms, this means the poor man had a crushed skull with multiple bone fragments. The ancient surgeon first carefully examined the wound, probing the fracture with his fingers to assess the damage. In a procedure that would make even the bravest among us cringe, he then painstakingly extracted the broken bone shards from the man's head using primitive surgical tools. Keep in mind, this surgery was performed without the benefit of anesthesia or sterile techniques. The excruciating pain and risk of infection the patient faced is almost unimaginable, yet somehow he survived the procedure. The Edwin Smith Papyrus goes on to describe how the wound was disinfected with honey and bound with fresh meat as a kind of poultice. Miraculously, the patient recovered, and the papyrus declares, "Thou shouldst say concerning him," one having a gaping wound in his head penetrating to the bone and perforating the sutures of his skull. While this story certainly attests to the skill of ancient Egyptian surgeons, it also highlights the brutality patients endured. In an age without pain relief or antibiotics, even routine medical treatments were often agonizing ordeals. Egyptian physicians relied on a variety of primitive remedies, such as burning, leeching, and bloodletting, that undoubtedly caused great suffering. The Edwin Smith Papyrus contains many other harrowing cases that reveal the harsh realities of ancient medicine. Alongside the cranial surgery, it details procedures for treating crushed vertebrae, broken collarbones, and deeply lacerated flesh, all with rudimentary tools and techniques. It even includes a case of a patient kicked by a horse who almost certainly died from his injuries. But beyond the Edwin Smith papyrus, archaeological evidence paints an even bleaker picture of Egyptian public health. Studies of mummified remains consistently show evidence of fractured bones, abscessed teeth, and nutritional deficiencies. Parasitic infections, tuberculosis, and malaria were rampant. Even non-elite Egyptians who were mummified display high incidences of worn joints, spinal deformities, and healed traumatic injuries, testifying to lives of ceaseless toil. For the average ancient Egyptian, life was nasty, brutish, and short. If disease, malnutrition, or injury didn't kill you, then you faced the prospect of drastic medical interventions that were barely better than the ailments they treated. It's sobering to think that even the basic comforts we take for granted today, like a dose of painkillers or a course of antibiotics, would have been unimaginable luxuries for our Egyptian ancestors. Yet in the face of such challenges, the ancient Egyptians soldiered on. Through trial and error over centuries, their physicians developed a great body of practical medical knowledge that far surpassed other ancient cultures. They set broken bones with splints, sutured gaping wounds, and even performed basic surgeries. In some ways, the story of ancient Egyptian medicine is a testament to human resilience and ingenuity in the harshest of conditions. But it's also a potent reminder of just how far we've come. The next time you suffer from a cough or a cut, take a moment to appreciate the incredible advancements in medical science that allow us to treat such ailments quickly and painlessly. Spare a thought for our ancient ancestors who had to endure so much more. The gleaming scalpels and sterile wards of a modern hospital would seem almost magical to an Egyptian physician toiling thousands of years ago. As we've explored in this series, life in ancient Egypt was difficult for people at all levels of society. From the oppressive heat and unforgiving environment, to war, disease, and social inequality. Hardship was an ever-present reality. By modern standards, the living conditions and daily trials Egyptians faced were almost unfathomably brutal. Yet in spite of it all, the ancient Egyptians built one of the most enduring and captivating civilizations in human history. Through their struggles and triumphs over more than 3,000 years, they left an indelible mark on the human story and continue to fascinate us to this day. There is perhaps a lesson in that, a reminder of the tenacity of the human spirit in even the bleakest of times. As we close this chapter on ancient Egyptian history, take a moment to reflect on all we've learned. From the halls of the Great Pyramids to the squalid huts of the poor, we've tried to paint an immersive picture of life in this fabled ancient land. The reality we've seen is often harsher and harder than our romantic imaginings. But that reality also makes the achievements of the Egyptians all the more remarkable. The next time you see the majestic mask of Tutankhamun or the towering pyramids of Giza, I hope you'll appreciate them in a new light. These wonders were born out of a world of struggle and strife we can scarcely imagine. They are enduring testaments to the grit and greatness of a fascinating civilization that through great adversity reached for the stars. Thank you for joining me on this journey through ancient Egypt. Although our time here was brief, I hope you found it both enriching and engaging. History has so many remarkable stories to tell, if we only take the time to listen. Even an era as distant as Egypt's Old Kingdom still has much to teach us about the human condition and our shared past. And with that, our Egyptian adventure must come to an end. But the annals of history are ever beckoning, filled with remarkable tales just waiting to be told. I hope you'll join me again soon for another boring journey back in time. Until then, this is your faithful history guide, bidding you good night and sweet dreams of pyramids and pharaohs. Be well, and I'll see you next time. The life of a pharaoh may seem glamorous and carefree from our modern perspective. All gold and glory, pomp and power, fawning subjects and monumental building projects to immortalize their names for eternity. But the sobering reality is that even for these god-kings, perched at the pinnacle of Egyptian society, life could be brutally cut short. Take, for example, the mighty warrior Pharaoh Thutmose III, who reigned in the 15th century BC during the affluent 18th dynasty. Thutmose was an aggressive military leader who conducted some 17 campaigns in 21 years, relentlessly expanding Egypt's empire into Syria, Palestine to the northeast. His most famous victory came in 1457 BC at the Battle of Megiddo, where Thutmose's forces routed a rebellious Canaanite coalition and captured the strategic walled city after a 7-month siege. The spoils of war were immense: over 2,000 horses, nearly 1,000 chariots, hundreds of suits of bronze armor and precious metals. Thutmose mercilessly executed opposing chieftains and their sons, while taking their women and children back to Egypt as slaves. But the cost was high, even for a seemingly invincible living god. While Thutmose's sprawling empire brought Egypt vast wealth and made him the most powerful man of his age, it also demanded that he spend much of his reign on distant battlefields far from the comforts of home. Soldiering in ancient times was a harsh existence, marching for weeks in the scorching desert sun, wearing heavy bronze armor and wielding cumbersome weapons like spears, axes, and shields in chaotic hand-to-hand combat. Battle wounds from bronze blades were often grievous and deadly, turning septic in unsanitary field conditions. Even as the supreme ruler, Thutmose could not escape the ever-present dangers faced by all ancient soldiers: dehydration, heat stroke, festering injuries, camp diseases. He likely witnessed hundreds, if not thousands of his men, perhaps even friends and family members, die agonizing deaths far from the sacred black silt of the Nile River. One near-contemporary account from the annals of Thutmose III describes the great conqueror breaking down and weeping in anguish after a victory, grieving for his fallen brothers, who would never return to Egypt. After a 54-year reign filled with relentless campaigning, Thutmose III died not on the battlefield, but at home in Memphis at the ripe old age of 56. A feat of remarkable longevity for an ancient Egyptian. His mummified body, discovered in 1881, showed a warrior pharaoh plagued by painful dental abscesses, arteriosclerosis, and severe arthritis, perhaps from old battle injuries. Even Thutmose the Magnificent, ancient Egypt's greatest imperialist, was ultimately humbled by the physical costs extracted by a life of brutality and conquest. While the pharaohs and nobles enjoyed a relatively lavish lifestyle compared to the masses, even the highest born in Egyptian society could not escape the harsh privations of their time. Disease, injury, infection, overwork, and malnutrition did not discriminate by class or rank. If anything, the weighty expectations and dangers faced by rulers like Thutmose III brought unique miseries and hardships all their own. From within their mud-brick hovels, the average Egyptian could perhaps be forgiven for looking up at the gold-bedecked pharaoh with not only reverence, but quiet envy. Yet a closer examination reveals the heavy toll paid by kings and commoners alike. Life at both the top and bottom of ancient Egypt's hierarchy was often a world of adversity and affliction, hidden behind a glimmering facade of power and prosperity. Of course, the struggles of the pharaohs pale in comparison to the daily brutalities faced by those at the bottom rung of Egyptian society: peasants, servants and slaves who toiled endlessly in backbreaking serfdom. While rulers like Thutmose III weathered the hardships of war and governance from positions of wealth and authority, the bulk of the population endured the ravages of nature and oppression without relief or recourse. For these masses making up the foundation of the Egyptian state and economy, life was dictated by the Nile River's fickle whims. In good years, when the annual floodwaters receded on schedule and deposited a thick layer of nutrient-rich black silt across the floodplain, Egyptian farmers could reap bountiful harvests of wheat, barley, figs, pomegranates, and other crops. The surplus supported nobles, scribes, artisans, priests, the entire vast apparatus of the centralized state. But when the mercurial Nile failed to deliver, the results were catastrophic. Too little water, and Egypt faced parched fields, withered crops, and barren harvests leading to widespread famine. Too much water, and raging currents burst the earthen dikes, sending deadly floods cascading through villages, destroying homes and livelihoods, and spoiling the crops with a layer of stagnant water. Either way, it was the peasants who suffered first and most gravely. One such calamity is recorded in the reign of the third dynasty pharaoh Djoser, who ruled from 2686 to 2649 BC. Ancient inscriptions tell of a terrible 7-year famine that ravaged Egypt when the Nile failed to flood sufficiently and left the fields barren. A text known as the Famine Stela describes the catastrophe in grim detail. All of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger to such a degree that everyone had come to eating their children. The entire country had become like a starved grasshopper, with people going to the north and to the south in search of food. Those who built tombs, those who carried stones, they all stopped working. During this time when the Nile was empty, the pharaoh was forced to open the royal granaries and import food from neighboring regions to prevent mass starvation and total societal collapse. But many still perished from hunger and the accompanying disease. The Palermo stone, an ancient Egyptian annal, bluntly lists a death toll of uncountable multitudes lost to the famine's grim embrace. Even in less extreme times, the threat of scarcity and starvation always lurked just one poor harvest away. Peasant families, who made up some 80% of the population, lived in small, cramped dwellings of mud and reeds, subsisting on a meager diet of bread, beer, onions, lentils, and dried fish. Sanitation was primitive at best, fostering rampant disease. Child mortality was appallingly high, with perhaps half of all infants dying before their first birthday from malnutrition and infection. From childhood, most Egyptians faced a lifetime of dawn-to-dusk drudgery in the fields, the construction sites, the quarries and mines. Agriculture was especially backbreaking under the relentless desert sun, planting and harvesting wheat, barley and flax by hand, operating crude wooden plows and hauling buckets of water from the Nile to irrigate the crops. All this for the privilege of handing over a sizable portion to the state as taxes in kind. During the inundation season, peasants not tending animals were often conscripted into forced labor gangs to toil on ambitious public works projects ordered by the pharaohs. The most famous of these were, of course, the massive pyramids erected as eternal resting places for the Old Kingdom rulers. The first and largest was the Great Pyramid of Giza, built around 2550 BC for the 4th dynasty pharaoh Khufu. This towering monument, originally 481 feet high and covering 13 acres, was constructed from over 2 million gigantic blocks of limestone, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus claimed that the Great Pyramid required the labor of 100,000 men, working in 3-month shifts over a period of 20 years. while modern Egyptologists put the figure closer to 20,000 to 40,000 workers. The fact remains that this undertaking demanded an almost unfathomable amount of human sweat and suffering. Most of the heavy hauling and lifting was done with the simplest of tools: ramps, sleds, rollers, levers, copper chisels, bronze saws, wooden rollers and sledges, ropes of papyrus and leather. Injuries from falling blocks, pulley failures and scaffolding collapses were common, not to mention crippling repetitive stress and musculoskeletal damage from decades of hard labor. Fractures, crushed limbs, hernias, gashes from flint axes and adzes, infected wounds, blistered skin, heat stroke. These were just some of the worksite hazards faced by ancient Egyptian laborers. Archaeological excavations of workers' cemeteries near the Giza pyramids have revealed the broken bodies of those who gave their blood and bones to build these eternal monuments. Skeletons show numerous healed fractures, severe arthritis, spinal deformities, and missing limbs, grim proof of the physical toll exacted by punishing labor. Yet as difficult as a life was for the average peasant conscript, it was even more brutal for those at the very bottom of Egypt's hierarchy, slaves. These were people captured as prisoners of war during military campaigns, or those who fell into debt bondage and became human property. Slaves were subjected to the harshest and most dangerous work, toiling in the mines, quarries and fields with even less rest or rations than the peasants. One of the most notorious sites was the gold mine of Bir Fawahir in the eastern desert. This desolate, searingly hot landscape was a virtual death camp for the slaves and prisoners sent to mine gold for the pharaoh's coffers. An account from the 12th dynasty reign of Amenemhat III, circa 1860 to 1814 BC, describes the hellish conditions in visceral detail. Those who are sent to the mine daily suffer hardship tenfold: scorched skin, bleeding feet, failing breath, broken bones. In summer, the miner's face is baked as an earthen pot. His bones are burned like summer flax. His skin hangs loose, ulcered and gashed from the stones. Starvation was a constant spectre, with meager rations that left miners malnourished and susceptible to the ravages of disease, especially silicosis from inhaling rock dust in the tunnels. Beatings from guards were frequent for those who faltered in their ceaseless toil. Many perished from injuries, illness, snakebite, and sheer exhaustion in this parched valley of misery. Life expectancy for a slave in the pharaoh's mines was often measured in mere months rather than years. So while the shimmering gold artifacts displayed in the Cairo Museum attest to the wealth and splendor of ancient Egypt's god-kings, they also symbolize the incalculable human suffering that made such opulence possible. Behind each dazzling death mask and gleaming sarcophagus lie the forgotten bones of faceless multitudes, ground to dust in service of a civilization that used them as grist for the mill of monarchy. Even those spared a life of servitude in the fields, mines and work sites still faced daily dangers and hardships in the Nile River Valley. The natural environment of ancient Egypt, while bountiful, was also filled with lethal perils. The Nile itself, the giver of life, was also a frequent bringer of death in the form of its apex predators, the Nile crocodile and the hippopotamus. Reaching up to 20 feet in length and weighing as much as a ton, the Nile crocodile was a fearsome ambush predator that haunted the imaginations of ancient Egyptians. With its armored hide, crushing jaws, and explosive speed, this cold-blooded killer took a steady toll on those who fished, washed, and drew water along the riverbanks. Children were especially vulnerable, snatched suddenly and dragged to a thrashing, drowning death in the river's murky depths. The hippopotamus, while a herbivore, was equally dangerous due to its highly aggressive and unpredictable nature. Males are ferociously territorial, and females will attack with little warning to defend their young. A bull hippo can weigh up to 3,000 pounds, run at 20 miles per hour, and crush a crocodile or a human like a grape with its massive jaws. Hippo attacks were a constant hazard for boaters and fishermen of the Nile. One harrowing account from the 12th dynasty, 1991 to 1802 BC, tells of a herdsman named Tabubu who was stalked and mauled by a lion while tending his cattle near the river. Although he ultimately survived, Tabubu's petition to the local governor relates the terror of the encounter. "A lion came at me. He hunted me as I fled, his teeth bared and his claws extended. 3 times he sprang upon me, and 3 times I used my spear to fend him off, but he kept coming. At last, I fell, and he stood over me, his putrid breath on my face. I knew my end had come, but the gods, for some reason, spared me that day." Tabubu's brush with death highlights the precariousness of life in a world filled with powerful predators and little in the way of protection or medical care if attacked. Even the king of beasts was a threat to those at the bottom of society's hierarchy. But perhaps the most insidious and inescapable danger in ancient Egypt came not in the form of large beasts, but rather tiny creatures. The multitude of biting insects that made life a misery for humans and livestock alike. Mosquitoes rising from the Nile's stagnant floodwaters unleashed the scourges of malaria and yellow fever. Biting black flies spread onchocerciasis, leading to blindness. Filth flies swarmed decaying waste, spreading dysentery and enteric disease. Lice and fleas infested hair, clothing and bedding, tormenting their hosts with ceaseless itching and biting. But by far the deadliest insect was the humble desert locust. When conditions were right, these voracious grasshoppers gathered into ravenous swarms of biblical proportions, darkening the skies and descending on fields to strip them bare of all vegetation in a matter of hours. A single swarm could number in the billions, covering hundreds of square miles and consuming over 400 million pounds of crops per day. For ancient Egypt's farmers, who eked out a precarious living from the Nile's floodplain, a locust plague was a catastrophe of existential proportions. One ancient text, known as the Admonitions of Ippur, from the First Intermediate Period, 2181 to 2055 BC, describes the devastation in apocalyptic terms. "What shall we do about it? All is ruin. The storehouses are bare. Behold, we are plundered by the locusts. The fields are desolate, and the food is gone. The children wail, 'I am hungry,' but there is nothing to give them. How long can we survive?" Such locust plagues were disturbingly frequent in Egypt's long history, triggering famines that unleashed starvation, disease, civil unrest, and societal collapse. Even the pharaoh in his palace could not escape the repercussions, as starving masses left barren fields to congregate in the cities, straining resources and threatening rebellion. Many scholars believe it was a series of locust-driven famines and droughts that ultimately toppled the Old Kingdom around 2200 BC, ushering in a dark age of chaos and fragmentation. So whether by large predators or tiny insects, the natural world posed endless perils for ancient Egyptians, rich and poor alike. But perhaps the greatest danger came not from without, but within, from the cutthroat machinations of power politics among Egypt's ruling elites. In a rigid hierarchy where life and death were the prerogatives of the pharaoh and his inner circle, court intrigues and plots swirled like scorpions in a bottle. One of the most notorious examples comes from the end of the 17th dynasty, around 1550 BC. The pharaoh Seqenenre-Tao-Desu, who ruled Upper Egypt from Thebes, was embroiled in a protracted struggle with the Hyksos kings who had occupied Lower Egypt and the Delta for the past century. Ancient accounts speak of a vicious feud between Seqenenre and the Hyksos ruler Apepi over perceived slights and competing territorial claims. In the course of this standoff, Seqenenre seems to have been the victim of court treachery, possibly with the collusion of his Hyksos rival. His mummy, discovered in 1886, showed the pharaoh had met a spectacularly brutal end, his head a virtual ruin of devastating wounds. The Theban king's skull had been pierced by at least 5 heavy blows, crushing his nose, shattering his cheekbones and jaw, and driving splinters of bone into his brain. What exactly happened remains a subject of debate, but Egyptologists believe Seqenenre was likely murdered either in his sleep or while restrained in some sort of palace coup. The subsequent hasty mummification, with no attempt to conceal the gruesome injuries or even remove the brain, suggest his killers were in a hurry to dispose of the body and cover up the crime. His wife, Ahotep I, seems to have held things together in a regency until their son Ahmose I was old enough. Some of the cruelest punishments in ancient Egypt were reserved for tomb robbers. The abundance of valuables buried with the pharaohs and nobles proved too tempting for many in the lower classes. Jewelry, statuettes, furniture and more could be stripped from tombs and sold on the black market for a hefty profit, making grave robbery a lucrative if perilous endeavor. Authorities went to great lengths to deter this rampant crime and protect the sanctity of the tombs. Armed guards patrolled larger tombs and cemeteries. The tombs themselves were filled with confusing mazes of passageways, dead ends and booby traps meant to thwart intruders. Secret entrances were designed to conceal burial chambers. The mummified bodies within were magically cursed by priests to rise up and torment any who disturbed their rest. But even with precautions, tomb robbery remained a persistent scourge. When thieves were caught, the penalties were brutal and horrifying. No half measures would do. A swift, painful death was only the beginning. To fully punish the malefactors and dissuade any who might follow in their footsteps, Egyptian justice took on a twisted, symbolic flair. During the reign of Ramses IX in the 20th dynasty, around 1100 BC, tomb robbing had reached epidemic proportions. The pharaoh's agents managed to capture a band of thieves who had long been plundering the nobles' tombs. Records from their interrogation paint a grisly picture of their fate. Under torture, the prisoners confessed to defiling numerous tombs throughout Egypt over many years. The great wealth they had pilfered was long gone, leaving nothing to recover. For their unforgivable transgressions, the authorities condemned them to an elaborately macabre execution. First, the thieves' noses and ears were cut off while they still lived. This was to deprive them of sensory pleasures in the afterlife. With anguished shrieks, the men were then impaled on sharpened stakes and left to writhe in agony as they perished. But the punishment did not end there. In a final, spiteful stroke, the desecrated corpses were gathered up and carried to a special embalmer. Though they no doubt stank of blood and fear, the bodies were carefully mummified according to sacred rituals. Each thief's earthly remains, once preserved for eternity, were ignominiously entombed in a mass grave, their organs and possessions scattered. This ghastly display was a dire warning to any who dared rob the dead. Not only would their lives be forfeit in the most painful manner, but their hopes for a joyous afterlife would also be obliterated. Denied all funerary rites and equipment, their souls would be lost between worlds, forever tormented. Though it may strike us as excessively cruel, Egyptians widely deemed the tomb robber's grisly fate as fitting justice. The afterlife was of supreme importance, and pyramid and tomb construction consumed untold resources. Stealing sacrosanct grave goods damaged the spirits of the deceased and undermined faith in divine order. Only the harshest retribution could answer such an affront to society. Of course, not every tomb robber was caught or punished so gruesomely, and in many cases, the corrupt authorities were involved in the thefts themselves. But the particularly vicious treatment of this gang in Ramses, the ninth time, stands as a potent reminder of the risks that came with the lure of easy riches. Life may have been short and brutal for the average Egyptian, but death could be even worse. Those who transgressed in life might find themselves facing down eternal suffering rather than eternal reward. The dreadful penalties for tomb robbery were perhaps the ultimate manifestation of ancient Egypt's preoccupation with the worlds beyond. So, while great wealth and power were hoarded by the elite in gilded palaces, the threat of mutilation and damnation kept the lower classes in line. One might almost pity the thieves so hellishly executed, were it not for the sacred significance of their crimes. In a society so focused on death, perhaps no punishment could be too extreme. Even beyond the famous pyramids at Giza, ancient Egypt was a land marked by tombs. They loomed ominously across the desert as earthly portals to the spiritual realms, and they beckoned to the desperate and daring with the allure of rich plunder and the peril of unimaginable suffering. Under the pharaoh's ruthless justice, to steal from the dead was to condemn one's own soul. The grisly fates of Ramses IX's tomb robbers serves as a dark warning. In a domain where the lines between natural and supernatural so often blurred, perhaps to violate the sleep of the deceased was to invite horror beyond mortal reckoning. Whether taken as historical fact or apocryphal tale, the execution of the tomb thieves offers another chilling glimpse into the severity of ancient Egyptian life and death. For the average Egyptian, so much of life revolved around staving off the ever-present spectres of poverty, pain, and oblivion. But even in death, there could be no escape or mercy for those who violated the sacred and social orders. In this unforgiving world of back-breaking labor and swift retribution, perhaps the only thing worse than suffering through life was facing the eternal consequences of one's earthly misdeeds. So while the magnificent monuments along the Nile still dazzle us with visions of Egypt's golden age, it pays to remember the blood and bone that supported those lofty ambitions. Behind each titanic stone was 100 forgotten tragedies. Beneath each shining treasure was an abyss waiting to consume the unlucky and the criminal. Though they could be unspeakably cruel, perhaps practices like the ghastly execution of tomb robbers were inevitable in a society so fixated on the worlds beyond. With cosmic order and immortal glory at stake, even petty crimes took on metaphysical weight. When your gods could devour your soul, what could be worse than the wrath of kings? In the final analysis, life along the Nile was perhaps little different than anywhere else in the ancient world. The mighty few enjoyed power and luxury, while the anonymous multitudes toiled and suffered in the dust. The difference was in how the Egyptians codified this stark divide between throne and throng in their spiritual beliefs. If a peasant was worked to death or executed for theft, it was divine will manifest. The social order, like the annual floods that nourished the Black Land, had its ultimate source in the gods. To the pharaohs and priests, even the cruelest deeds were justified in service of upholding the eternal balance. There could be no mercy for those who threatened the cosmic symmetry in this life or the next. The thieves who dared to undermine the sacred compact between the living and the dead had to be destroyed utterly, their wretched souls scattered like chaff in the desert wind. For in ancient Egypt, the line between order and chaos was razor thin, and the price for transgression was beyond measure. So the next time you find yourself marveling at the works of the pharaohs, spare a thought for the legions of the forgotten who perished in their making. Ponder the fates of those who toiled in the city of the dead, and those who dared to steal from it. And remember that there in the domain of the deathless kings, to rob a tomb was to court oblivion itself. Despite the oppressive hardships of forced labor, ancient Egyptians still found small ways to maintain their dignity and humanity. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of worker villages near the pyramids where the conscripted laborers and artisans lived during the long years of construction. Skeletal remains show many suffered from arthritis, herniated discs, and other repetitive stress injuries. But amidst the backbreaking toil, these workers still carved out an existence for themselves and their families. Excavations have revealed that the laborers lived in simple mud brick apartments laid out in orderly rows. Each unit housed 4 to 8 workers, likely organized into teams. The village even included amenities like communal dining halls, breweries for making beer, and kitchens for baking the abundant bread that formed the foundation of their diet. This suggests that the workers were at least adequately fed and housed, and not simply treated like expendable slaves. We also see evidence of community and social bonds. Potsherds and limestone flakes served as rudimentary writing surfaces, and a few bare messages like "Friends forever" or "May you be well and healthy." Children's toys and carved game boards have been found, hinting at leisure time and the presence of families. And the dead were buried with care, some even with small grave goods. All of this paints a picture not of faceless drones, but of real people enduring together through difficult circumstances. The backbreaking labor in merciless desert heat must have been grueling, but within their camps the pyramid builders could enjoy a modest meal, sip some beer, and perhaps escape their burdens for a while with a game among friends. These simple comforts probably made the difference between soul-crushing misery and a harsh but tolerable existence. Of course, their labor was still forced, and no amount of bread and beer could change the fundamental injustice of their servitude. These workers were not willing volunteers, but captives and conscripts. The term slave may be too simplistic, but they were certainly not free. Their relative privileges were ultimately still granted at the whim of the pharaoh and his officials. The ancient Egyptians had no word for freedom as we conceive of it. Even for those of higher status, one's life was always in service to the god-king and the state. The very concept of individual liberty was as foreign to their world view as the green forests of distant lands. Hieroglyphs speak of serving or following the pharaoh, but never of personal freedom. This lack of even an idea of freedom may be difficult for us to imagine, but in a world where the pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of divine rule, obedience was not just a duty, but the very purpose of one's existence. To toil and sweat in the service of the king was, in a sense, the highest calling, even if it was not a choice. From a modern vantage point, building colossal pyramids to glorify god-kings may seem like a frivolous waste of human effort. The size and grandeur of these monuments required an almost unimaginable marshalling of labor and resources. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, is estimated to have taken around 20,000 workers over 20 years to complete, using more than 2 million limestone blocks, each weighing an average of over 2 tons. Multiply this by the dozens of other pyramids that stud the Nile Valley, not to mention the countless temples, tombs, obelisks, and statues, and the scale of conscripted labor over the centuries becomes staggering. Generations lived and died in service to the pharaoh's monumental visions, an edifice complex unrivaled in human history. Even as the once sharp angles eroded over the millennia, the sheer audacity and hubris of these projects endure. And yet, despite the immense cruelty and exploitation involved, there is still something undeniably awe-inspiring about the pyramids rising eternally from the desert. They are testaments to human ingenuity, skill, and sheer tenacious willpower, even if misapplied. The pharaohs may have been tyrants, but the workers who realized their fevered dreams were not mindless drones. In their own way, they achieved a kind of immortality through their creations. Admittedly, this is cold comfort to the many who suffered and died to achieve that immortality. If given the choice, Most would probably have preferred to lead simple agrarian lives, tending to their crops and cattle. Instead, circumstance drafted them into lifelong servitude, hauling multi-ton blocks up an artificial mountain in the scorching heat. Their reward was not riches or fame, but perhaps a slightly larger ration of bread, a jug of beer, and a simple mud brick tomb. Yet even within these harsh constraints, they strove to fill their days with what meaning and humanity they could, however meager. In the end, their legacy is not just in the soaring monuments they left behind, but in the humble traces of their everyday struggles and fleeting joys. A crude message of friendship, a makeshift doll, a game board carved from limestone. These are the artifacts of real human lives, glimmers of light in the shadow of the pyramids. As we gaze up at the towering achievements of the pharaohs and marvel at the ancient Egyptians' architectural prowess, let us also remember the many hands that made it all possible at such a heavy cost. The true wonders of Egypt are not just the grand tombs of kings, but the quiet resilience of the laborers who endured lives of grinding hardship to build them. In their own way, they too have endured through the ages, quietly waiting for us to unearth and remember their stories. For all its beauty and mystery, ancient Egypt was a civilization steeped in exploitation from its very foundations. The unimaginable splendor of the pharaohs' courts and the golden glories of their tombs were paid for with the sweat and blood of tens of thousands. This is the dark underside of the dazzling veneer, the cost measured out in endless years of toil beneath the whips of overseers. Yet, it is a testament to the indomitable human spirit that even in the face of such oppression, people found small ways to persist and endure. In the cool shadows of mud brick huts, conscripted pyramid builders found solace in friendship, community, and the modest comforts of food and leisure. They may have been bound in service to the god kings, but they stubbornly carved out spaces for their own humanity. These everyday Egyptians, whose names are lost to history even as the kings they served live on in eternal fame, are the real ancestors of the land. Dynasties rose and fell, the kingdoms of Pharaoh flourished and faded, but the common people endured through the millennia, passing down their quiet resilience from generation to generation. In their stories of suffering and survival, we may find a more relatable and enduring legacy than in all the gold of the royal tombs. The ancient Egyptians believed that to speak the name of the dead was to make them live again. Perhaps then, simply learning about the lives of the pyramid builders and conscripted laborers is a kind of remembrance, a way to honor their struggles and their humanity across the vast gulf of time. They may not have been kings or gods, but they too have earned a place in eternity. Word count, 1,231. The mummified body of the thief lay on display, a grim warning to any who would dare rob the sacred tombs of the pharaohs. Grave robbing was an epidemic during the reign of Ramses IX in the 12th century BC. Times were desperate, and many turned to plundering the riches buried with the kings of old. But the price of feeding one's family with grave goods was a horrific death. The condemned were tortured brutally to reveal the locations of their hidden loot and accomplices. Arms were twisted until they snapped. Backs were lashed into bloody shreds. Embers were pressed into bare flesh. Anything to make them talk. And in the end, they all did. Swift and terrible retribution came next. The lucky ones were simply beheaded, their severed heads mounted on pikes. Others suffered slower, crueler fates, flayed alive, impaled through the gut, or entombed in a sarcophagus with ravenous flesh-eating beetles. The bodies were then mummified and callously stuffed into the very tombs they tried to rob. These ghastly punishments may seem barbaric today, but Egyptian culture held a strong belief in eternal life after death. The pharaohs expected to enjoy forever the treasures buried with them. Stealing those grave goods didn't just deprive the kings of their wealth, it threatened their immortality. Such a sin against the gods could not go unanswered. So the mummies of the tomb robbers stood forever in the tunnels they violated, an eternal sentence. Their disfigured remains proclaimed the perils of desecrating the dead. The authorities made sure all the gory details spread through the kingdom to discourage other would-be thieves. Life may have been desperate for the peasants of ancient Egypt, so poor they would risk even the pharaoh's curse. But in death, the kings always won. The more of their subjects they could pack into their plundered tombs, the better. As if the threat of torturous execution wasn't worrying enough, ancient Egyptians faced plenty of other mortal perils in daily life. The very wildlife of the Nile River Valley where they made their home teemed with deadly animals. The Nile's banks crawled with Nile crocodiles, enormous armored reptiles that could drag a fisherman to his doom in a flash of thrashing teeth. Portly hippos may look docile, but they are fiercely territorial and can slice a man in half with their great tusks. Growling lions prowled the desert dunes, occasionally picking off a shepherd or a wanderer. Poisonous serpents like cobras and vipers lurked in the underbrush or coiled beneath woodpiles, striking out with lethal venom. And the dagger-like stingers of desert scorpions packed an agonizing toxic punch. No Egyptian was ever far from something that could kill them, from the lowliest mud-splattered peasant to the highest-born royal. Even Pharaoh Menes, the legendary unifier of Egypt himself, is said to have met his end in the jaws of a rogue hippo along the riverbank. Nature's fury spared no one. Of course, humans weren't the only ones who suffered from the deadly fauna of the Nile. The beasts took their toll on each other as well. A tomb painting from around 1900 BC depicts the story of a humble herdsman named Tabubu and his harrowing encounter with a lion. As Tabubu drove his cattle along their grazing grounds one evening, he suddenly heard a terrifying roar. Whirling around, he came face to face with a mighty male lion, its tawny mane bristling and yellow eyes glaring. Tabubu froze in utter fear, knowing he was no match for this ultimate predator. The lion crept closer, muscular shoulders rippling beneath its hide. It let out a chilling growl that turned Tabubu's legs to water. He could only watch helplessly as the great cat sprang at his herd, crushing a young calf's neck with one slash of its terrible claws. As the rest of the cattle bellowed and stampeded in panic, Tabubu seized his chance. He turned on his heel and fled, knowing he was abandoning his livelihood, but desperate to save his own skin. The dying bleats of the calf echoed behind him as he ran. Tabubu managed to reach safety and lived to tell the tale depicted on the tomb wall. But his ordeal was an all-too-common one. For peasant farmers and herdsmen, protecting their animals from the likes of lions, crocodiles, and hippos was a constant struggle. A struggle that could mean the difference between putting food on the table or going hungry. But perhaps no pests wreaked more havoc upon the ancient Egyptians than creatures of a much smaller size, the insects. While the scarab beetle was revered as a sacred symbol of rebirth, most of Egypt's insects sparked only revulsion and fear. Locusts were the most dreaded of all. Huge swarms of these voracious grasshoppers would descend upon the land seemingly out of nowhere, covering the skies like a writhing curtain for miles. They devoured every plant in their path, stripping fields bare of wheat, barley and vegetables in hours. A severe locust infestation could completely decimate harvests, leaving no food to fill the kingdom's granaries. Famines followed in the insects' wake as surely as the gnawed stubble of ravaged crops. All the farmers could do was pray, burn offerings, and wait for the relentless swarms to pass. Other creeping and buzzing vermin made the Egyptians' lives a daily misery. Flies swarmed around them in thick, droning clouds, and mosquitoes whined incessantly in their ears at night. Ants invaded their mud brick homes, and roaches skittered underfoot. Lice and biting fleas tormented their skin, and intestinal worms robbed their bodies of precious nutrients. All these parasitic pests not only made for constant discomfort, they spread disease. With poor sanitation and close quarters, outbreaks of malaria, dysentery, and typhoid fever scourged the populace. The Egyptians had no understanding of the role insects played in dispersing these illnesses. They could only blame the gods or evil spirits. Between the untamable wilds of nature and the squalid conditions of their man-made society, sickness and death shadowed the Egyptians' every step. Even the luckiest and wealthiest could never fully escape their spectre. But perhaps those who bore that burden most heavily were the very youngest. In the unforgiving environment of ancient Egypt, children were the most vulnerable of all. It's estimated that as many as 1 in 3 infants died before their first birthday. Only about half of all children lived to see the age of 5. The child mortality rate was staggering. Malnutrition and disease claimed countless young lives. Starvation was an ever-present threat for the poorest families, and even the more prosperous struggled to nourish their children during lean times and famines. Contaminated food and water spread dysentery, cholera, and other deadly intestinal diseases. Childhood injuries and accidents were often fatal as well. Young ones tumbled into the Nile's waters and never resurfaced, or were snatched by crocodiles as they played on the banks. They were trampled by oxen in the fields or crushed under toppling mud brick walls. Snake bites, scorpion stings, and infected wounds frequently proved too much for their small bodies to overcome. But even more insidious were the ailments no one could see. Invisible, microbial killers that struck without warning. Newborns shuddered with tetanus contracted through the cut of an unclean blade. Diphtheria ravaged tiny throats and choked the breath from fragile lungs. Scarlet fever scorched across delicate skin and seared vulnerable brains. Without vaccines or antibiotics, no amount of a mother's desperate prayers or a healer's herbs could reverse these grim diagnoses. Parents were left clutching, cooling, lifeless forms to their chests, keening their grief to an indifferent sky. So ubiquitous was childhood death that the Egyptians almost seemed to expect it. Many didn't name their babies for months after birth, perhaps to spare themselves even greater heartache when the near-inevitable loss occurred. Children weren't seen as full members of society until around the age of 5 or 6, when their odds of survival finally improved. For those youths who did endure, there was little time to celebrate. As soon as they were able, most children were put to work alongside their elders. Farmers' sons followed their fathers into the fields. Daughters helped their mothers grind grain, carry water, and tend to younger siblings. In artisans' workshops, nimble young fingers wove flax into linen and shaped clay on the potter's wheel. Among the poorest families, children as young as 5 could be sold into servitude to pay off their parents' debts. They might labor as unskilled workers on the pharaoh's building projects, hauling bricks and buckets of sand bigger than they were. Or they would be sent to toil in a noble's home, sleeping on the kitchen floor and scrubbing, fetching and serving from dawn to dusk. This back-breaking labor took a harsh toll on growing bodies already weakened by malnourishment and illness. Many children bore evidence of severe anemia, stunted growth, spinal deformities, and degenerative joint diseases. Others lost fingers, toes, or limbs to infected wounds and fractures that never healed right. But perhaps most poignant are the rare archaeological finds that attest to the love behind the loss. In the ruins of the workers' cemetery at Deir el-Medina, a child-sized mummy was discovered, still clutching a beloved toy carved in the shape of a cat. A baby buried with a rattle fashioned from a turtle shell, so they would never feel alone. Heartbreakingly small skeletons were unearthed, still enfolded in their weeping parents' arms, interred together for all eternity. Delicately painted wooden coffins held the fragile remains of infants, commissioned despite the crushing poverty of their bereaved families. These whispering remnants remind us that no matter how long ago they lived, these were parents who adored their children. Each of these burials represents a life cut monstrously short and a grief too heavy to ever fully leave behind. The ancient Egyptians may have had no choice but to carry on in the face of such staggering childhood mortality. But the pain of a parent who has had to lay their precious child into the dust is timeless and unending. But tragically, once an Egyptian managed to survive the perils of childhood, the dangers of growing up still weren't over. As children developed into puberty, the grim threat of death in childbirth reared its ugly head for half the population. In ancient Egypt, as in most societies throughout history, a woman's primary role was to marry and bear children to carry on the family line. Girls were seen as fertile property first and foremost, and their individual hopes and desires came a distant second to their marital obligations. Daughters were considered under the strict authority of their fathers, brothers, or nearest male relative. When deemed old enough, usually by the age of 12 or 13, a girl would be married off to the husband of her father's choosing. Her groom was often significantly older than her, and the match was based on social status and economic or political benefits rather than love. From there, a new wife's chief duty was to bear her husband as many children as possible, especially sons. But in an age before modern medicine, this biological imperative came at a devastatingly high cost. Complications of pregnancy and childbirth were the leading cause of death for women in their reproductive years. Without reliable contraception, an Egyptian woman could expect to become pregnant 5 to 8 times over the course of her life. Each pregnancy was grueling in a time of poor nutrition, inadequate prenatal care, and physical hardships. Expectant mothers continued to perform grinding domestic labor and haul heavy loads right up until their babies arrived. The childbirths themselves were excruciating and perilous ordeals, fraught with the possibility of life-threatening complications that the women were ill-equipped to survive. Laboring mothers writhed and pushed for hours or days, with only the most rudimentary assistance and comfort. Trusted female relatives and midwives attended them, but these helpers could only call upon traditional folk wisdom, herbal remedies, and prayers to the goddess Taweret. All too often, that wasn't enough. Babies became hopelessly stuck in the birth canal, slowly suffocating as their exhausted mothers hemorrhaged around them. Fetuses that couldn't fit through narrow hips were dismembered with primitive instruments. Infections raged and claimed feverish bodies. Women's perineums ripped beyond repair, leaving them with lifelong agony and incontinence if they didn't bleed out first. Even if a new mother managed to successfully deliver a healthy baby, her risks were far from over. The postpartum period was rife with opportunities for further loss of life. Retained placentas caused septic shock. Breastfeeding difficulties and mastitis wasted women to shadows. Fatal blood clots lodged in weakened lungs and stopped tired hearts. Some women lived through the trauma of multiple stillborn babies, miscarriages, and neonatal deaths before finally succumbing themselves. Others survived only to be rendered sterile by scarring and were cast aside by husbands who valued them solely for their fertility. Lest we think only peasant women suffered such cruel fates, the mummified remains of queens and princesses tell similar stories. Damage to their pelvic bones and evidence of severe birthing injuries have been found in the corpses of some of Egypt's highest-born ladies. Not even royal blood could save them from the inescapable dangers of their sex. As in childhood, the spectre of sudden death lurked at every stage of an ancient Egyptian woman's life. From pubescent bride to birthing bed, the grim cycles of fertility bound their bodies to an existence that was all too often cut unnaturally short. There was no escaping the perils of simply being female. The best an ordinary woman could hope for was to bear living children to secure her place in the family, and then to toil in servitude and ill health into old age. The worst was an agonizingly prolonged descent into darkness, drowning in her own blood, amid the stench of lurid infection and the wails of the motherless infant she left behind. But even women who managed to avoid the ravages of death in childbirth still faced oppression and restriction at every turn. In ancient Egypt's rigidly patriarchal society, a woman's worth depended entirely on her relationship to the men who controlled her. Daughters were always under the authority of their fathers or nearest male relative. At no point in her life was a woman considered an autonomous being. She couldn't own or inherit property or land, except under extremely rare circumstances. A woman was essentially the property of her father, then her husband, to be disposed of as he saw fit. A respectable woman's role was to serve as a virtuous wife and mother, overseeing her household and ensuring her husband's comfort and pleasure. Grinding grain, baking bread, brewing beer, spinning linen, tending children, and satisfying her husband's sexual urges were a woman's chief purposes from dawn to dusk. Her most prized attributes were her modesty, obedience, and fertility. An intractable or barren wife could be cast out of the family, left to starve or forced into beggary and prostitution. A husband was well within his rights to beat or mutilate a disobedient wife for even trivial offenses, and no one would come to her aid. While in theory, marriage was supposed to be a partnership of complementary equals, in practice, the husband held all the power and made all the decisions. Women had little to no autonomy, even within their marriages. A subservient wife was expected to be quiet, pliant, and submissive, never challenging her husband's actions or opinions. Anything less could invite brutal punishment. Under this system of institutionalized subjugation, women had no true freedom to pursue their own wants and needs. Any hint of independence or defiance could cost them their livelihoods, reputations, and even their lives. Simply by virtue of their gender, they walked a razor's edge every day of their existence. Of course, there were some notable exceptions to these rigid gender roles. A small number of elite women rose to great power and prestige, usually through their connections to the pharaoh. Royal wives, mothers, and daughters could wield significant influence over the king and the court. Some ruled outright as female pharaohs. Others served pivotal roles as gods' wives of Amun, officiating the holiest religious rituals. But these women were extraordinary aberrations, not the rule. The vast majority of Egyptian women, from the poorest peasants to the low nobility, had no such avenues to authority. Their prescribed lot in life was to serve men, bear children, and work until they dropped. Any deviance from this path was swiftly and harshly punished. Even one of ancient Egypt's most famously powerful women was still ultimately subservient to the men in her life. Queen Nefertiti, the great royal wife of the rebel pharaoh Akhenaten, is renowned for her stunning beauty and the unprecedented status she held in her husband's reign. Reliefs and statuary depict Nefertiti in poses previously reserved only for a pharaoh, such as crushing Egypt's enemies beneath her feet. She is shown officiating in religious ceremonies alongside Akhenaten, not as a meek consort, but as a partner, a revolutionary concept. Some evidence even suggests she may have ruled in her own right after his death. But despite her privileged position, Tabubu's frightful encounter with the lion highlights the ever-present dangers that wildlife posed to the ancient Egyptians, even in their day-to-day activities. Lions, along with crocodiles, hippopotamuses, cobras, and scorpions were a constant threat, particularly for those who worked outdoors in fields or along the Nile. A moment's inattention or a stroke of misfortune could lead to tragedy. But it wasn't just large, ferocious beasts that made life miserable for the Egyptians. Smaller creatures like insects and rodents also took a heavy toll. Locust swarms were an occasional but devastating menace, capable of stripping fields bare of crops in a matter of hours. a major locust infestation could wipe out food supplies, causing widespread famine and starvation. Even in regular times, pests like mice, fleas, flies, and grain weevils made Egyptian homes rather unpleasant places to inhabit. These vermin spread filth, spoiled food stores, and carried diseases, much to the distress of families. It was an unending battle to keep them at bay in the cramped living quarters. Given the many dangers and discomforts of the natural world, perhaps it's no wonder that the ancient Egyptians placed so much spiritual emphasis on controlling and appeasing the forces of nature through magic, ritual, and religion. They recognized their own vulnerability in the face of untamable wildlife. But as threatening as nature could be, there was another danger to Egyptian children and families that was even more heartbreaking: the grim spectre of childhood mortality. For all but the luckiest Egyptians, death was a frequent visitor to the family home, snatching away infants and youngsters with devastating regularity. The rate of child mortality in ancient Egypt was appallingly high by modern standards. It's estimated that around 1 in 3 Egyptian children died before the age of 5, with even more perishing before reaching adulthood. The causes were many: complications during childbirth, malnourishment, infections, accidents, and injuries. With limited medical knowledge, Egyptians were often helpless to save their ailing little ones. For parents, the grief of losing a child was compounded by the economic hardship it represented. Children were an important part of the family labor force. From a young age, they helped in the fields, pastures, and workshops, or contributed to running the household. Losing these small but valuable workers made the family's struggle for survival even harder. This high mortality rate had a major influence on Egyptian family life. Couples tended to have many children, not only to ensure that some would survive, but to provide security for the parents' old age. Large families with many siblings were the norm, even though it strained resources. The more spares you had, the better your odds of having descendants to provide and care for you in your twilight years. Egyptian parents lived with the knowledge that some of their beloved children would likely be taken from them too soon. It was a painful reality that even the pharaohs in their palaces weren't immune to. The famed boy king Tutankhamun, for example, was preceded by 2 stillborn daughters, tiny mummies that were buried with him to be cradled in the afterlife. Indeed, the shadow of childhood death loomed so large that it was woven into Egyptian religion and culture. Children were buried with great care and ritual, often with grave goods like toys, amulets, and food to comfort them in the afterlife. The goddess Isis was revered as the protector of children, alongside deities like Bes and Taweret. Magical spells and medical treatises offered remedies and protections for youngsters. Yet the sad truth was that no amulet, spell, or offering could ward off every danger in an Egyptian child's path. For bereaved parents, the only real comfort was the belief that their lost little ones would live again in the beautiful field of reeds, where life was easy and suffering unknown. The trauma and sorrow of losing a child is something that transcends culture and history. It remains one of the most devastating experiences a parent can endure. But for the ancient Egyptians, it was an inescapable part of the fabric of family life, along with all the other hardships they faced. Perhaps it was this constant brush with mortality that made the Egyptians so intent on savoring life's joys and pleasures, indulging in music, dancing, feasting, and games. They understood all too well how fleeting and fragile one's time on earth could be. And so, they cherished their living children fiercely, showered them with affection, and did their best to prepare them for the duties and trials to come. But despite their best efforts, Egyptian parents couldn't shield their children from every danger. And one of the greatest threats to a child's health and safety often came from the very people who were supposed to protect them: Egypt's primitive doctors and surgeons. To our modern eyes, the medical practices of ancient Egypt seem positively gruesome. While Egyptian medicine was actually quite advanced for its time, incorporating observation, diagnosis, and treatment, it was still a crude and unsanitary affair. Much of an Egyptian doctor's repertoire would be considered barbaric by today's standards. Medicines were made from all sorts of nauseating ingredients like rotten meat, animal dung, fly specks, and dirt. Cuts and wounds were dressed with raw meat poultices crawling with bacteria. Headaches and seizures were treated by drilling holes in the patient's skull. Ailments and illnesses were blamed on evil spirits or the malign influences of deities. Surgery, too, was a grisly business. While Egyptian surgeons were skilled enough to set broken bones, repair wounds, and even conduct brain surgery, their operations were medieval in nature. There was no anesthesia beyond a swig of alcohol or a knock to the head. No antiseptics or sterile tools, just knives, hooks and saws that were wiped clean and used again. It's a wonder that anyone survived these procedures at all. We can perhaps forgive the Egyptian physicians for their shortcomings. After all, they were working without the benefit of modern medical knowledge. They could not see the germs that caused infection, or understand the circulatory system, or diagnose internal ailments through X-rays and scans. In a world where even a minor scrape could lead to a fatal infection, their brutal treatments likely did save some lives. Still, an ancient Egyptian sickbed was the last place you'd want to be. Your suffering would likely be prolonged with ineffective and excruciating treatments. And if you were unlucky enough to be selected for surgery, you had to pray that your constitution was strong enough to withstand the shock and blood loss, and that Sekhmet or Heka would save you from succumbing to your doctor's cures. We can see a glimpse of this frightening medical landscape in the famous Edwin Smith papyrus. This ancient Egyptian text, dating back to 1600 BC, is the oldest known surgical treatise in the world. It's a stunningly detailed document, describing 48 different medical cases and their treatments, from head wounds to spinal injuries. One particularly graphic case details a patient with a compound fracture of the skull. The unlucky patient's brain is exposed, pulsing through the shattered bone. The attending surgeon calmly assesses the wound, probing it with his fingers, noting the bleeding and the sunken fragments of skull beneath the scalp. His recommended treatment? Poultices of honey, oil, and lint to cover the gaping wound, prayers and spells to the healing deities, and a grim warning that this is an ailment not to be treated. In other words, the patient is likely doomed. It's a chilling snapshot of the stark realities of Egyptian medicine. No comforting bedside manner, no pain relief, no real hope for recovery from a catastrophic injury. Just pragmatic, almost detached analysis, and an unspoken acceptance that the human body's fragilities and mysteries were beyond the physician's powers. For most patients, the best-case scenario was likely a prolonged and unpleasant recovery, with the added risk of complications and secondary infections. The worst case was an agonizing, drawn-out death, often caused by the very treatments that were supposed to save them. It's a far cry from the gleaming hospitals and advanced surgeries of today, but as brutal as Egyptian medicine could be, it was still a vital and respected part of their society. Doctors were highly regarded professionals, sometimes even accorded semi-divine status. Their skills and knowledge were seen as a gift from the gods, a weapon in the eternal battle against suffering and death. And in a world where so many perils lurked, from wild beasts to raging battles to the simple ravages of time, those skills were always in demand. The ancient Egyptians could only place their trust in the wisdom of their doctors, and pray that Heka, Sekhmet, and Isis would guide their hands. They had little other choice. The grim litany of dangers and hardships we've explored, from the harsh environment to oppressive rulers to unseen parasites and diseases, paints a harrowing picture of life in ancient Egypt. It was a world where suffering and struggle were woven into the very fabric of existence for all but a charmed few. Yet in spite of the many trials they faced, the Egyptians managed to build one of the most enduring and spectacular civilizations in human history. Their monuments still tower over the desert sands. Their golden masks and sarcophagi glimmer in museum vitrines. Their gods and myths continue to captivate our imaginations. How did they achieve such heights in the face of such adversity? Sheer tenacity, ingenuity, and grit, for starters. The ancient Egyptians were masters of persevering through hardships, of finding ways to adapt and innovate, of harnessing the power of human cooperation on a massive scale. But more than that, they were driven by a powerful set of shared beliefs. A conviction that the gods could be appeased and the forces of nature controlled through worship and ritual. A faith that earthly power mirrored heavenly order, and that their pharaohs had a divine mandate to rule. A certainty that life, in all its difficulty and impermanence, was just one phase in an eternal journey, and that the virtuous would find their reward in the paradise of the afterworld. These beliefs gave the Egyptians a sense of purpose, structure, and continuity that helped them endure the upheavals of history. The humble peasant toiling in the fields could see his mundane labors as part of a cosmic cycle of death and regeneration. The soldier marching off to battle trusted that the gods would fight alongside him, and that his sacrifice would be celebrated forever. The grieving parent laying a child to rest in the tomb knew it wasn't a final farewell, but a temporary parting before a joyful reunion in the field of reeds. In many ways, Egypt's spiritual world was a mirror image of the material one, but perfected, sanctified, stripped of pain and want. It was an idealized plane of existence where the Nile never ran dry and the harvests never failed, where bodies were made whole and incorruptible, where justice always prevailed and all souls found peace. Glimpsing this shining vision of eternity gave the Egyptians the strength to carry on through the worst of times. Perhaps that is the greatest wonder of the ancient Egyptians, not their temples or their tombs, but their extraordinary resilience in the face of adversity. Their ability to confront the darkest aspects of the human experience, the suffering and cruelty and loss that are inescapable in any age, and still maintain an unwavering faith in beauty, order, meaning, and the ultimate triumph of the eternal over the temporal. It's a staggering existential achievement, one that resonates with us still across the vast gulf of time. We may have antibiotics and air conditioning and the rule of law, but we still grapple with the fundamental vulnerability of the human condition. We still seek to impose a measure of meaning and permanence on the chaos of the world. And in our own modern way, we're not so different from the ancient Egyptians, building our pyramids of glass and steel, crafting our identities for the digital afterlife, reaching for transcendence through art and ritual and shared myth. We are all of us fighting the same battle they did, striving to endure and to matter in the face of life's briefness and brutality. So perhaps the deepest lesson we can take from the hardships of ancient Egypt is one of humility, empathy, and awe, a recognition of what the Egyptians were up against and of what they managed to accomplish in spite of it all, a respect for the grit and grace of the men, women, and children who lived and struggled and found beauty along the Nile so long ago. And above all, a profound sense of our shared human journey, our common quest to make something lastingly meaningful out of our finite and fragile lives, as the ancient Egyptians did with such tenacity and splendor. It's a struggle we're all engaged in across the ages and around the world, and there is wisdom and solace to be found in remembering that we do not walk this path alone. The shadows of the Valley of the Kings grow long as the sun sinks behind the cliffs, painting the vast Theban necropolis in shades of gold and fire. The heat of the day begins to fade into the cool of the evening. In the twilight, the ancient past feels close enough to touch. You can almost hear the chanting of the priests, the whisper of linen robes, the rattle of funerary jewelry as a mummified pharaoh is carried to his final resting place. For a fleeting, shimmering moment, the veil between the worlds grows thin. But then the first stars begin to glimmer in the deepening blue, and the spell is broken. The tombs and temples recede into shadow, their secrets sealed away for another night. The long-ago voices fade into silence, and yet the stories remain. The triumphs and the tragedies, the soaring monuments and the forgotten graves, the prayers and the protests and the ever-flowing river. They linger in the land, in the artifacts, in the very dust, an eternal testament to the endurance of the human spirit. We may walk a different road, under different skies, but the ancient Egyptians are still with us, as all those who came before us are. Their hopes and their heartbreaks, their wisdom and their warnings, their unyielding insistence on creating meaning in the face of life's harshness, all of it echoes in our own journeys. So let us remember them as we lie in the dark and drift towards dreams. Let us carry their stories with us and add our own verses to the time-worn tale. Let us face our own struggles and sorrows with the same courage and the same unwavering faith. For we are all part of the same ancient current, all heirs to the same human inheritance. The Nile still flows from the heart of Africa to the sea, and the cycle of the sun still turns from the eastern horizon to the west. And as long as the story continues, as long as there are those who remember and dream and build, a part of ancient Egypt will live on, not in the cold permanence of stone, but in the warm breath of the telling. Good night, and may your journey through the field of reeds be joyful and filled with light. Life in ancient Egypt was often nasty, brutish, and short for the majority of its inhabitants, while the towering pyramids, glittering golden treasures, and regal pharaohs in their magnificent headdresses capture our imaginations. These are carefully curated snapshots that don't reflect the harsh realities faced by most Egyptians, high and low alike. Behind the burnished veneer of wealth and artistry lay a civilization built on backbreaking labor, rigid hierarchy, and the unforgiving caprice of the natural world. One of the greatest hardships ancient Egyptians contended with daily was the oppressive social hierarchy that defined every aspect of life. The pharaoh reigned supreme at the apex of the pyramid, revered as a living god whose word was absolute law. Beneath him was a small cadre of nobles, priests, and scribes who wielded power and privilege. But the vast majority of Egyptians toiled at the bottom as farmers, laborers, and slaves, with little hope of upward mobility. The lives of the peasantry were an endless cycle of ploughing, planting, harvesting, and paying heavy taxes in grain to the state and temples. Most barely scraped by, living hand to mouth in crumbling mud brick hovels. During the annual flooding of the Nile, they were conscripted to work on the pharaoh's great building projects in the searing heat of the sun. The lucky ones hauled limestone blocks up ramps to construct the pyramids. Others dug canals, repaired dikes, or dragged barges laden with obelisks and colossal statues hundreds of miles. It was exhausting, dangerous work using only the most primitive tools and brute strength. We can only imagine the suffering of the estimated 100,000 laborers who built the Great Pyramid of Giza over 20 years during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, around 2550 BC. Barefoot and bare-backed, they worked in punishing conditions, chiseling and hauling 2.5-ton blocks up a sweltering stone ramp to a height of over 450 feet. Injuries, sunstroke, and death were commonplace. Barracks and cemeteries around the pyramid show that workers often died before the age of 30 from the extreme physical strain, bone fractures, and lung disease from inhaling stone dust. And yet Khufu himself lived in supreme luxury, sailing his royal yacht, Horizon of the Two Lands, up and down the Nile, hunting lions in the desert, and being fanned by servants under the cedar roof of his palace. The contrast between those who commanded the labor and those who gave their lives to it couldn't be starker. At least the pyramid builders were technically free subjects and not slaves, though one wonders if there was much difference given their lack of control over their lives and destinies. But true slavery was widely practiced in ancient Egypt. Captives seized in military campaigns were pressed into a lifetime of forced labor in the galleys, quarries, mines, and fields. And any Egyptian could be enslaved for falling into debt, which happened frequently in times of famine, or when the Nile failed to adequately flood and yield a good harvest. Records from the reign of Pharaoh Sneferu around 2600 BC tell of severe hardship when the annual inundation was too low for several years in a row. With crops withering in the fields, many farmers became destitute. To feed their families, they sold themselves into bondage to their creditors and to labor on the pharaoh's building projects. Sneferu commissioned the first true pyramid, the Red Pyramid, at Dashur. Thousands slaved to build his monument in the blazing desert heat, many dropping dead from exhaustion and deprivation. To add insult to injury, Sneferu decreed that slaves could now be put to death for the crimes of their masters and have their skins stretched over his drums. Such was the complete dehumanization and expendability of a person who had the misfortune to become enslaved. But even the pharaoh himself was not immune from the harsh brutalities of ancient Egyptian life, especially given the endless wars and military campaigns waged to expand and defend the empire's borders. While pharaohs were worshipped as invincible god-kings, many met their ends violently on the battlefield or saw their reigns marred by turmoil and bloodshed. A life of conquest and military glory was deemed the highest virtue for a pharaoh, but it came at a steep price. Perhaps no pharaoh embodied the relentless military zeal more than Thutmose III, who led 17 campaigns into Canaan and Syria over 20 years in the 15th century BC. At the Battle of Megiddo, Thutmose crushed a coalition of rebelling Canaanite chieftains after a daring march through a narrow mountain pass. He slaughtered hundreds, displayed their bodies before the city walls, and took their hands and penises as grisly war trophies. As the annals boast, His Majesty returned in joy of heart to his father Amun. His Majesty came bearing the plunder with Asiatic captives, chiefs' children, and their horses. The total, 340 living prisoners and 83 hands. Years of desert warfare undoubtedly took a physical and mental toll on Thutmose. The heat, exertion, strain, and stress weathered his features, carved new scars and lines into his flesh. And what of the thousands of young Egyptian men who marched off to fight alongside him, never to return, or who came back maimed, burned, and broken in body and spirit? How many wives became widows? How many children were left fatherless? And how many parents mourned sons lost to the pharaoh's glory? The price of empire was paid in blood. Even in times of peace and plenty, average Egyptians had little respite from the hardships of their daily existence. The unforgiving climate and environment along the Nile were a constant source of misery that knew no social class. From nobleman to fisherman, the merciless Egyptian sun beat down on all, scorching exposed skin and stinging the eyes with its glare. Shade was scarce in the villages and fields, and sunstroke felled many who laboured too long without respite from the heat. Dehydration was an ever-present threat that could kill a man as surely as any weapon. The annual Nile flood so critical for irrigating the fields with rich black silt, also brought destruction and danger. A flood that was too high could wash away entire villages, drown livestock, and leave thousands destitute. But a flood that was too low withered the crops and brought famine, as it did during the reign of Pharaoh Djoser around 2670 BC. Djoser, who commissioned the first step pyramid at Saqqara, faced a crisis when the Nile failed to rise for several years, leaving the fields parched and cracked. People wailed in the streets, children's bellies swelled with hunger, and the air reeked of rotting cattle carcasses. Djoser had to open the state granaries and import food from abroad to stave off collapse. But even when the Nile behaved, it was full of dangers. Crocodiles basked menacingly on the banks, ready to drag the careless to a watery demise. Hippos capsized fishing boats and mauled villagers who strayed too close. And the river harbored the dreaded schistosomiasis worm that caused an agonizing, bloody urinary disease. Daily life was stalked by perils at every turn. For most ancient Egyptians, home offered little refuge from the harsh environment. The typical mud brick house had just a few small rooms clustered around an open courtyard, with a roof of palm logs and thatch that let in the scorching sun and the frigid night air. Furniture was minimal: a low stool, a wooden headrest, some woven reed mats for sleeping on the packed dirt floor. Rodents, scorpions, and snakes often crept in through the crevices. Hygiene and sanitation were poor. Garbage and human waste piled up in fetid heaps that attracted insects and disease. Most people had just a single linen garment to wear until it rotted off their backs. Diet for the lower classes was also spare and monotonous. Bread and beer formed the cornerstone of most meals, along with some vegetables like onions, lentils, and radishes. Meat was a rare luxury. Malnutrition left people vulnerable to a host of afflictions like anemia, scurvy, and bone deformities. Parasites like roundworm and tapeworm were almost universal. Arthritis, tuberculosis, and abscesses ravaged weakened bodies. Physical evidence from commoner cemeteries reveals the harsh toll of this excruciating daily existence. Life was especially brutal for ancient Egyptian women, who had very little autonomy or agency of their own. Women were essentially considered the property of their fathers or husbands, to be disposed of in marriage as soon as they reached puberty. They could not own property, initiate a divorce, or live independently. Their primary value was in their fertility and ability to produce children, preferably sons, for their husbands. Many girls became mothers as young teens and risked death in childbirth. A woman who could not bear children was frequently cast out. In fact, child mortality was so high that many Egyptians didn't name their babies for several weeks, lest they become attached to one who might perish. Perhaps 1 in 3 infants died before their first birthday from disease, accidents, and malnutrition. Young children had to grow up fast to avoid the same fate. As soon as they could walk and carry a load, they were put to work in the home and fields to contribute to the family's survival. Most had no opportunity for schooling and followed their parents into lives of poverty and toil. In time, even the magnificence of mighty pharaohs crumbled to dust, plundered by the depravity of their descendants. The spectacle of public executions, where suspected tomb robbers were brutally impaled or had their noses and ears cut off before being staked out in the sun to die, became more frequent as the kingdom declined. Corruption, greed, and lawlessness gnawed at the roots of the natural order, Ma'at, which had sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia. And so ancient Egypt, that endlessly fascinating and romantic land that has captured imaginations for centuries, was also a place of tremendous brutality and human suffering on a mass scale. The price of mighty monuments and golden treasures was paid by countless oppressed, uneducated, and sickly subjects whose voices are largely lost to history. Life for most was a constant struggle against hunger, disease, injustice, and untold miseries. And yet they endured, finding what small joys they could, building families and friendships, striving to uphold Mawat and earn a blessed afterlife, all while in the shadow of their oppressors. Perhaps that is ancient Egypt's greatest legacy, the resilience of the human spirit to persist and reach such heights of artistic and cultural achievement despite the odds. Its people showed that the will to organize and create can coexist with the capacity to exploit and destroy. That fragile beauty and meaning can be forged amid the harsh crucible of chaos and suffering. Like the imperishable stars the Egyptians revered, their works and their wonder have endured across the ages to inspire us today, even as the full brutal reality that birthed them fades mercifully into the realm of distant history and half-remembered dreams. Childhood in ancient Egypt was a precarious existence. Infant and child mortality rates were heartbreakingly high, with many children not surviving to see adulthood. The skeletons of children are among the most common remains found by archaeologists, a grim testament to the frequency of early death. Malnutrition was a constant spectre, as limited food variety and occasional famines stunted growth and left children vulnerable to a host of illnesses. Infectious diseases like smallpox, tuberculosis, and pneumonia claimed countless young lives, as did intestinal parasites from impure water and contaminated food. With no vaccinations or antibiotics, even a minor cut or everyday infection could quickly prove fatal to a child. Accidents were another common killer in a world of open cooking fires, unprotected wells, free-roaming livestock, and dangerous wildlife. Drownings, falls, burns, and animal attacks added to the litany of hazards. For those children who survived infancy, the spectre of death still loomed large. Ancient Egyptian parents were well acquainted with the grief of burying a child. Elaborate child burials with carefully crafted grave goods, miniature coffins, and even mummification attest to the emotional devastation of losing a son or daughter. Some families endured the pain of losing multiple children. It's believed many Egyptians had frequent pregnancies to ensure some offspring survived. Children were an insurance policy against the harsh realities of the time. Yet there was little time to shelter or coddle children, however much parents may have wanted to. The demands of daily survival meant that children were put to work early in life, assisting their parents in household tasks, agricultural duties, or learning a craft or trade. For peasant children, this often meant backbreaking labor in the fields or tending livestock in hazardous conditions. Children of artisans would toil alongside their parents in hot, dusty workshops. Even for children of nobility, the responsibilities and expectations of their position allowed for only a fleeting childhood. The exception was royal children, and even then only for a short time. Princes and princesses enjoyed lives of plenty and privilege, with servants and slaves attending to their every need. They had time for play and school, learning to read, write, and master subjects like math, science, geography, and foreign languages to prepare them for the duties of leadership. Yet royal children also faced strict discipline, rigid social rules, and high expectations. A royal son in particular was expected to train as a military commander and uphold all the functions of kingship. Any physical or character failing could dash his prospects. The Crown Prince Ptahshepses, for example, is believed to have lost his position for the transgression of dallying with a royal concubine. For royal daughters, childhood was largely a prelude to marriage, either to a brother, half-brother, or carefully selected noble to solidify the dynastic line and political alliances. While they could become powerful queens in their own right, their path was still closely prescribed. and even royal children were not immune to the health hazards of the time. Tutankhamun's tomb, for instance, contained 2 mummified fetuses thought to be his prematurely born daughters. As in many ancient societies, childhood was a luxury that most Egyptians simply could not afford. Growing up was less of a nurturing journey than a survival gauntlet against a multitude of dangers, demanding an early maturity. This stark reality puts the incredible accomplishments of the Egyptian people in even sharper relief. That they built such a sophisticated civilization in the face of unrelenting hardship is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. While ancient Egyptians had some remedies to alleviate suffering, medical treatment was still a gruesome and terrifying prospect for most. Without the benefit of modern science, the ancient Egyptians relied on a mixture of practical observation, trial and error, and spiritual beliefs to address injury and disease. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating back to around 1600 BC, provides a sobering glimpse into the realities of ancient Egyptian medicine. This remarkable document details 48 surgical cases, each laid out with clinical notes on injuries, diagnoses, treatments, and prognoses. The cases range from gaping head wounds to fractured collarbones to crushed vertebrae. It's both a pioneering work of empirical medicine and a horrifying record of the suffering of ancient patients. In one particularly graphic case, a patient has suffered a severe compound fracture of the skull, with cranial debris and exposed brain matter. The unnamed surgeon describes his examination, thrusting the fingers into the opening and probing the wound. He notes the fluttering, crackling sensation beneath his fingertips. With admirable honesty, he records his judgment: an ailment not to be treated. For this unfortunate patient, the injury was deemed too catastrophic for intervention. Other treatments described in the papyrus and other medical texts are scarcely less harrowing. Broken bones were set with wooden splints, wounds stitched up with linen thread or bronze wire. Lacerations were cleaned with copper salts, which had antiseptic properties. But there was no understanding of germs, and thus no sterile technique. Infection was a constant risk. Cauterization with red-hot irons was a common recourse for stemming blood loss and sealing wounds, a horribly painful process. For internal ailments, Egyptian physicians prescribed a host of potions, poultices and purges, made from herbs, minerals, and animal products. Moldy bread was applied to infections, a primitive sort of antibiotic. Honey was used as a salve for cuts and burns. Raw meat was packed into open wounds to promote healing. Onions and garlic were consumed to boost health. Yet many treatments were utterly misguided, based more on superstition than science. Leeches and bloodletting were thought to purge the body of unbalanced humors. Incantations and appeals to deities were recited in the belief that sickness was divine punishment. Animal dung was a popular ingredient in many remedies. It's sobering to think of the agony patients endured for cures that likely only worsened their condition. Surgery, though rudimentary, was a well-established practice. Ancient Egyptian medical instruments included bronze scalpels, obsidian blades, bone saws, probes, forceps, and scissors. These tools allowed for surprisingly complex procedures like craniotomies, cataract removals, and dental extractions. Yet major surgeries were performed without anesthesia. Patients held or tied down, biting on leather straps in agony. At best, they may have been knocked unconscious or intoxicated with alcohol. Opium poppy extract may have provided some post-operative pain relief for those who survived the procedure. Despite the best efforts of skilled physicians, many patients succumbed to complications, shock, and sepsis. Mummified remains show the scars of all manner of medical interventions, from healed fractures to cranial boreholes to amputations. These were the lucky ones. Untold others surely died on the operating tables of the Old Kingdom. While ancient Egyptian medicine was advanced for its time, laying the foundation for later Greco-Roman and Arabic medical traditions. Its limitations meant a great deal of unnecessary suffering. In a world without germ theory, antibiotics, or pain management, even minor injuries and illnesses were a source of dread. The fear of a toothache, a broken bone, or an infected cut was entirely justified. To be sick or injured in ancient Egypt was to be at the utter mercy of primitive medicine. For all but the luckiest patients, treatment was as brutal as the underlying condition. It was a reality that even the wealthiest and most powerful could not escape. As we ponder these grim aspects of ancient Egyptian life, it's important to remember that this was the daily existence for millions of people over thousands of years. The accomplishments of this great civilization, from the majestic pyramids to the sophisticated irrigation systems to the exquisite artistic works, were achieved in the face of unimaginable adversity. The Egyptians lived, loved, created, and endured despite the constant specter of disease, injury, violence, oppression, and loss. Their tenacity in building a society of such grandeur and resilience is awe-inspiring. Yet we must be cautious not to romanticize this resilience. The hardships of ancient Egyptian life were not noble or ennobling. They were tragic and often needlessly cruel. The majority of people lived in grinding poverty, with few rights or freedoms, under the constant threat of sickness, hunger, and mistreatment. That they persevered is a testament to the human will to survive, but it does not negate the injustice of their circumstances. In studying ancient history, it's easy to get swept up in the grand narratives of kings and conquests, the dazzling artifacts and architectural wonders. But we must also acknowledge the darker undercurrents, the stark inequalities, the casual brutality, the precariousness of life for the masses. Only then can we truly appreciate the full scope of the human experience across the arc of time. The story of ancient Egypt, then, is not just one of monumentality and mystery. It is also a story of struggle and striving in the face of often overwhelming odds. It's a reminder that behind every great achievement are countless untold tales of hardship and perseverance. The Egypt we marvel at today was built on the suffering of millions who toiled, endured, and hoped for a better life under the relentless sun. As we conclude our journey through the darker aspects of ancient Egyptian history, we are left with a profound sense of perspective. The grandeur of the civilization takes on a new poignancy when balanced against the grim realities faced by its people. Their lives were, by our modern standards, often brutish and short. Yet they endured, generation after generation, to build a society of such enduring influence and fascination. Perhaps the greatest lesson we can take from this exploration is one of empathy and humility. It's easy to judge the past through the lens of our present sensibilities and knowledge, but to truly understand a civilization, we must strive to see the world as they did, with all the fears, beliefs, limitations, and aspirations that shaped their choices and actions. In the end, the ancient Egyptians were not so different from us. People striving to make sense of their world, to find meaning and joy in the face of hardship, to leave a mark upon the shifting sands of time. Their triumphs and their tragedies echo across the millennia, reminding us of the shared humanity that binds us across the ages. So let us remember the ancient Egyptians not just for their pyramids and pharaohs, but for their resilience in the face of unrelenting adversity. Let us marvel at their ingenuity and artistry, while also acknowledging the suffering that so often underwrote it. And let us approach their history with empathy and respect for the countless nameless souls who lived, struggled, and died along the Nile's winding course. In doing so, we not only enrich our understanding of the past, but also our appreciation for the present and our hopes for the future. For as long as humans have walked this earth, we have faced hardships and found ways to overcome them. That eternal cycle of struggle and resilience is the very essence of our shared story, a story in which ancient Egypt plays a profound and enduring part. And so we come to the end of our journey through the darker annals of Egyptian history. As we drift off into slumber, let our dreams be haunted not by the spectres of suffering, but illuminated by the eternal light of the human spirit that shone so brightly in the land of the pharaohs. For in confronting the shadows of the past, we emerge with a fuller understanding of the radiance of human resilience. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. And may your dreams be filled with the wonders of the ancient world as the Nile carries us gently to a new dawn. The life of a slave in ancient Egypt was a brutal existence of backbreaking labor, meager rations, and the constant threat of punishment or death. Slaves were considered the property of their masters, to be used and disposed of as seen fit. Most were captives, taken in wars with neighboring lands like Nubia to the south. Others fell into debt bondage, forced to toil endlessly to repay loans. The lucky slaves worked as domestic servants in the households of the wealthy, where conditions were somewhat better, but the vast majority slaved in the fields from dawn to dusk, planting, tending, and harvesting crops along the Nile. It was grueling work in the scorching Egyptian sun. Cruel taskmasters pushed them to their limits, wielding whips to maintain control and productivity. Perhaps the worst fate for a slave was to be conscripted into forced labor on the pharaoh's massive building projects. Teams of slaves joined with peasants to construct the colossal pyramids that still dominate the Egyptian landscape today. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for Pharaoh Khufu around 2580 BC, is a breathtaking marvel of engineering and human toil. Hundreds of thousands labored for decades to construct this tomb for the god king to enjoy in the afterlife. Khufu, also known as Cheops, was the son of Sneferu and second pharaoh of the 4th dynasty. By all accounts, he was a megalomaniac obsessed with building the largest pyramid ever. Standing over 480 feet tall and composed of 2.3 million blocks, weighing an average of 2.5 tons each, the Great Pyramid was the tallest man-made structure in the world for 3,800 years. The logistics alone were staggering, but Khufu was relentless in his vision, conscripting a labor force of over 100,000 from across Egypt. They came from all walks of life: slaves, farmers, even skilled artisans and craftsmen. All were expendable resources to be used up in service of the pharaoh's vanity. Working conditions were abysmal. Laborers toiled in gangs to cut, transport, and stack the huge limestone blocks in the searing heat. Skeletons found in the workers' cemetery show signs of arthritis, spinal deformities, and other crippling injuries. Many died on the job from accidents, malnutrition, and sheer exhaustion. They were simply discarded in shallow graves in the sand. As a divine ruler, Khufu never gave a thought to the human cost of his self-aggrandizement. He and the elite enjoyed lives of luxury and leisure, while slaves and commoners broke their bodies to build the king's glorious tomb. This stark disparity between the classes was a fact of life in ancient Egypt. Other pharaohs were equally obsessed with monumentality and uncaring about the price paid in human misery. Sneferu, Khufu's father, constructed 3 pyramids that were only dress rehearsals for his son's magnum opus. The first, the Meidum Pyramid, was a stepped structure that the pharaoh decided to encase in limestone to create smooth sides. But the substrate proved unstable, and the pyramid collapsed during construction, likely killing many workers. Undeterred, Sneferu started again with the bent pyramid at Dashur. Named for the awkward angle of the sides, this odd-looking edifice was another design failure. The king ordered the pyramid built on unstable ground, and the base started to sink during construction. the panicked architects reduced the angle of incline from 54 degrees to 43 degrees halfway up, creating the distinctive bent shape. Again, an unknown number of slaves perished. Finally, Sneferu got it right with the Red Pyramid, named for the rusty hue of its limestone casing. At 341 feet, it was a sizable structure, though it would be dwarfed by Khufu's later Colossus at Giza. The Red Pyramid was a functional funerary complex, but the pharaoh was not yet satisfied. He needed one last rehearsal before handing the reins to his successor. And so, the aged king commanded yet another pyramid to be built beside the bent pyramid at Dashur. Known today as the Black Pyramid, very little remains of this mysterious structure. Some Egyptologists believe it was abandoned when Sneferu finally died, his megalomaniac vision left unfinished as his consciousness winged toward the afterlife. All told, Sneferu may have pressed nearly 1 million souls into forced service to construct these testaments to his own vanity. The number crushed by blocks, broken by falls, or cut down by disease and deprivation is impossible to calculate. But no price in blood was too high for the whims of the living God. Such was the lot of the average Egyptian. While slaves had essentially no rights, the peasant class was only slightly better off. Farmers were not owned outright, but they were still subject to the absolute power of the king and compelled to labor for the state for a portion of the year. During the season of Akhet, the annual Nile flooding, gangs of peasants were conscripted to work on irrigation projects, dredge canals, and shore up dikes under royal decree. When the king required their labor, farming families' fields went untended, lowering their crop yields, and these yields were already taxed heavily by the state as well. It was a precarious cycle that left most commoners living on the edge of subsistence, always fearing a bad flood, pest infestation, or poor harvest that could plunge them into destitution and hunger. Some desperate peasants ended up selling themselves into debt servitude when times got too lean. A loan of seed grain or a few livestock could lead to a life of indentured service and misery, with entire families enslaved to pay off ever-increasing interest to landowners and moneylenders. The wealthy also sometimes enslaved children outright, breaking apart families. Punishments for slaves who displeased their masters were always brutal. Beatings, brandings, and mutilations were common for minor offences. Those who attempted escape could expect execution in a variety of horrific ways: impalement, beheading, being burned alive, or fed to Nile crocodiles as a warning to others. The bodies were often displayed publicly as a macabre message, but despite the cruelty, the enslavement, the subjugation, and lack of freedom, Egyptian slaves and peasants endured. They raised families, told stories, sang songs,